Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Ashen Souls, Fallen Hearts in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 16, A Fragile Line. Rodrigue arrived at the monastery in a graceless crash. His hair was notably disheveled, and his horse was completely exhausted from the journey. A few of the Frildarius soldiers looked as if they hadn't slept since leaving their home territory, and Dimitri wouldn't have been entirely surprised if that was the truth. He knew how long the journey was, especially through the snowy weather of that came with this time of year. Fairgus was icy on the best of days, but there had been a particularly brutal storm earlier in the week, and that only made the journey harder to complete. But Rodrigue had managed to complete it regardless, and he entered the monastery gates with a light sigh on his lips and relief on his face. The Blue Lions were gathered in front of the monastery as they awaited his arrival. He had sent a messenger ahead to say that he was almost at Garag Mach, and that had been enough to earn him the attention of the current Blue Lions class. All 8 of them were watching him with varying degrees of respect and concern. Felix, as was to be expected, didn't even give Rodrigue a second glance, instead just looking at the ground as soon as he had made sure his father was all right. Felix was just as stubborn as ever, and even with the sudden declaration of a civil war, he was giving his father the cold shoulder to some degree. It wasn't at all surprising, but it stung a little bit regardless. Rodrigue was quick to cover for that though, instead taking a few steps toward Dimitri where he stood a short distance in front of the rest of his class. "I'm glad to see you safe, Your Highness," Rodrigue said as he examined the prince from head to toe. Sure enough, Dimitri looked fine, surprisingly so, as a matter of fact. Given the circumstances, Rodrigue would have expected Dimitri to have come close to crashing when he hit the edge of his limits, though he had worried for nothing in the end. Dimitri was still intact, and he was putting on a brave face on top of it all. Rodrigue would have been proud if he wasn't so completely exhausted. "The same to you, Rodrigue," Dimitri nodded. "My apologies for making you come all this way and then forcing you to turn around again so soon. The Knights of Syros want us to set out tomorrow morning to ensure that we can reach the capital in time to help the people there." "It's no issue at all, Your Highness," Rodrigue assured him. "I came here knowing that was going to happen, and I'm all right with it. As long as we can fight together, I have no complaints at all. Your uncle must be stopped no matter what, and I know that better than anyone." "I never would have thought he would go this far," Ingrid hummed with a shake of her head. "I knew he was a less favored ruler than the previous king, but this. It's going way too far. People cross the line when they get desperate," Felix pointed out bitterly. "I don't know what made him think all of this was a good idea, but it's not my problem either. If he's going to declare a civil war, then we're going to have to stop him. He made his choice, and we're going to make sure he puts up with the consequences." Rodrigue held back a wince at his son's crass phrasing, but he made no moves to scold Felix for it either. Instead, he turned his attention back to Dimitri. "This battle will not be easy. The Western lords have already begun rallying around the Grand Duke, and I doubt they will back down regardless of what we do. They won't step back until they're confident they've lost the battle. We can come up with a strategy once we set out for Fhirdiad," Mercedes pointed out. "For now, you've made a long journey. Perhaps it would be for the best if you took some time to rest." "I agree," Dimitri chimed in. "This is hardly a conversation we should be having when you're so exhausted. Try to get some rest. We can discuss our plan for the battle later today or in the morning. It'll be all right." Rodrigue hesitated at that. He wanted to disagree with Dimitri, to insist that he could keep working on their battle strategy, but he knew better than that. He had been given an order, and Rodrigue was not one to shy away from the commands he received. Instead, he simply nodded. "Of course. Thank you for your hospitality, everyone. I can show you to your room. Lady Rhea spared nothing in ensuring you had only the best to welcome you after your journey," Dimitri said. He started to escort Rodrigue away from the monastery's entrance as a few Knights of Syros stepped up to take care of his horse and ease his other soldiers out of the adrenaline rush that came with their quick flight from Frildarius territory. The tension in the air was palpable, and Rodrigue wished there was something he could do to soothe it. However, he was in no position to even make the attempt, so he instead just nodded to Dimitri and followed the prince deeper into the monastery. The truth was that he was exhausted, and he was looking forward to being able to rest without worrying about being attacked in the night. That fear had struck him many times over the course of the last few days since he was forced away from Frildarius, but he could finally allow it to fade now. He was safe, and he would continue to be safe even as he turned back to march into the fire once more. He had reinforcements now, and they would be his saving grace. This was not what he had wanted, but he had a path forward now, and that was all that mattered. Annette had to admit that she felt much better now that she had agreed to back down from the upcoming battle. She didn't feel as guilty about staying behind since Ash was staying with her too, and that apparently counted for a lot when she was worried about her friends. Ash knew pushing it wouldn't be a good idea, and they would be able to support one another through it all. It was a massive weight off Annette's shoulders to know it was all right for her to stay behind. She still wanted to do her part to help with the battle preparations since she couldn't actually join the rest of the group in their march to Fhirdiad. Rodrigue's arrival had opened a floodgate of many other requirements to ready everyone for the next battle, so even though Annette had previously exhausted all her potential tasks, she had something new to do now, and she was beyond relieved for it. She needed to be able to do something to help everyone out if she was going to stay behind. Her mind wouldn't leave her alone if she didn't try. Annette had been going about her regular business of helping with the battle preparations when she caught a glimpse of him. She immediately stopped what she was doing to turn and look at the tall orange-haired knight who called himself Gilbert. She had seen him many times since first coming to the monastery, but they had never spoken. He always seemed to have some reason to avoid her, and Annette couldn't seem to convince him to talk. He knew how to avoid her, and Annette couldn't get around that no matter how hard she tried. She knew the truth. Of course she did. Gilbert was not his name, and it never would be. That was her father, Gustav, and seeing him made Annette feel sick to her stomach. It had been years since her father left behind her family, but the pain never quite seemed to lessen. Annette had hoped she would feel better when she eventually saw him again, but all of that hoping had been for nothing. The instant she saw him at the monastery, all that old pain came back once again, piercing her through and leaving old wounds raw and bloody even years later. When Annette looked at Gustav, she remembered what it had been like to feel abandoned as a young girl, to wonder why her father had left her. She had hated herself just in case she had done something to drive him away, and she yearned to understand what had gone wrong so she knew how to fix it. But she wouldn't be able to fix it there in Garreg Mach. Gilbert was still avoiding her, and that gave her yet another reason to not go out on this mission. He was going to be fighting on the side of the Blue Lions as one of the Knights of Syros backing their army. Annette would just end up feeling worse if she fought at his side. He wouldn't answer any of her questions, and she would end up feeling like a little girl all over again, not understanding what she had done to drive her father away. Annette stared at Gilbert for a long time before she forced herself to focus once again. He had come to blame himself for the tragedy of Dusker after Lambert's death, and Annette knew that. Him leaving the family behind had seemingly been a matter of him trying to punish himself for his failures, but in all honesty, him running was just hurting the people around him rather than punishing him. Annette was suffering just as much as he was, and at that point, it barely felt like penance. It was a poison upon the entire Dominic family, and Annette didn't know where to look to find the antidote. Annette bit down on her bottom lip and walked away before she could get any bold ideas about trying to talk to him. It would only make her feel worse, and she knew it. He had ignored her before, and he would ignore her again. Annette was already in a fragile enough emotional state because she had to sit out of the Blue Lions' first major battle, and she wasn't going to set herself up for failure by trying to speak with a father that seemingly didn't want her. That was what it always came down to at the end of the day. It didn't matter just how much Gilbert was trying to punish himself for his failures. It always spread out and wound up hurting Annette and the rest of their family. She had wondered for a long time if she just wasn't good enough for him, and she had never received an answer. Even now, Annette was convinced she must have done something wrong if he had left at all. Was there something she could have done to make him stay? Had she just not been trying hard enough? Was the blame meant to rest on her shoulders above all else? Deep down, Annette knew it was ridiculous to imply something like that. She had been a child when the tragedy of Dusker took place. She hadn't even been a teenager yet. How could she have been responsible for so much at such a young age? The doubt always found a way to creep back in though, and Annette's mind hurled accusations at her before she could stop it. She finished carrying supplies a few moments later, and as soon as she had dropped off the random pile of things with the knights, she headed back to her room. All thoughts of helping had been thrown out the window by seeing Gilbert again. She couldn't even remember what she had been trying to help with in the first place. Annette just wanted to not feel like garbage for a few minutes. Was that too much to ask? Annette closed her door behind herself before she collapsed onto her bed with a heavy sigh. She pressed her hands against her eyes, willing tears to not form or fall, but she knew that wasn't going to be the end of it. She was already upset, and what happened next was out of her control. She just wanted to understand why her father was ignoring her. Was that really so much to ask? Apparently, the answer was yes. Gilbert was off to help Dimitri and the rest of the Blue Lions to push through the attempted coup, and there was nothing Annette could do about it. Gilbert could fight without worrying about the grace of House Dominic, but Annette had to stay behind. None of it was fair. Why did the father who left her behind get to help her friends while she was forced to stay at the monastery? Why couldn't she just get a break? Annette stared up at the ceiling of her room as she pushed out a loud, irritated sigh. There was nothing she could do to change her circumstances, as much as she hated to admit it. She would just have to deal with it no matter how little she actually wanted to. She had to wonder if the goddess was out for her blood. The worst part was that a positive answer wouldn't have even surprised her. The following morning, the Blue Lions started marching with the Knights of Syros at the crack of dawn. Ashen and Annette went out to bid them all farewell and good luck. Annette deliberately avoided looking at her father, instead waving to Mercedes with an enthusiasm that poorly and barely hid her grief. Ash looked at her out of the corner of his eye, but he said nothing. They would have time to talk. After all, there was nothing they could do but wait until their friends returned. They had all the time in the world. The Holy Kingdom of Faerghus was a place of dignity and respect. There were many rules that came with living in the country. Some of them were simple while others were complicated. The first rule was the simplest of them all though: do not disturb the status quo. Dimitri had felt the pull of this rule from a very young age, and he still felt it today. It always seemed to leak into every aspect of life in Faerghus. There were expectations to be followed by everyone regardless of status, and those rules stood firm for each and every person who called the country home. There was a flow of life in Faerghus, and the worst thing anyone could possibly do was disturb that peace, whether it be for their own benefit or not. It was unthinkable and unholy, an insult to the very traditions that helped the nation to grow and thrive each day. Silence and compliance were the best options if someone found themselves suffering under the weight of something in the country. Whatever would rock the boat the last was the course of action every single citizen was expected to take, and there was no room for exception. It was this rule that had prompted Dimitri to stay silent for so long about the actions of his uncle, both past and present. The royal line had seen enough disturbance as far as he was concerned, and if him staying quiet would make everyone else's lives easier, then he was more than willing to do it. After all, what prince wasn't willing to make sacrifices for his people? Over the years since Rufus had taken over the throne of Faerghus, Dimitri had known him to do many things, and most of them were negative. Rufus enjoyed himself a bit too much around women, for one, and Dimitri had heard whispered complaints about it for years. Nobody ever spoke louder than whispers though. That was too dangerous when it came to the traditions of Faerghus, and no one wanted to be the one to shatter that peace. Every step needed to be taken carefully and quietly, and they all knew it. Dimitri had his own issues with his uncle, as was to be expected, but for the most part, he had stayed quiet about them. He knew a variety of assassins had been sent his direction by his uncle for the sake of solidifying his position on the throne, but each time, he had endured. Dimitri didn't make a fuss about it at all. He didn't want to inconvenience anyone, first and foremost, but above all else, he didn't want to break the peace the kingdom was finally holding so dear. It was dangerous for anything to fall out of line when they had been walking such a fragile boundary line between peace and war for so long. If Dimitri's silence would bring peace to his people, then he was more than happy to remain quiet for as long as he had to. It was better for everyone that way. Dido was the only one who knew the extent of the assassination attempts and what that meant for Dimitri. The prince hadn't even brought it up to Felix, Sylvain, or Ingrid, already knowing how they would respond. They would be outraged, but in the end, it would mean nothing. He knew just as well as they did that none of them could rock the boat too much. Faerghus was a fragile country rooted in tradition, and Dimitri's words would shatter many people's faith in the past that had brought them to this point. Rufus may have tried to kill Dimitri many times, but there was next to nothing Dimitri could do about it without risking another war. He supposed that had happened without him even needing to get involved though. Rufus wasn't keeping his distaste for Dimitri a secret any longer, and that finally allowed others to get involved. Rufus had gotten away with his various assassination attempts many times over the years because of the Faerghon instinct to keep secrets like that hidden for the sake of the status quo, but there was no way he would be able to sweep this under the rug. In attacking Rodrigue, Rufus was openly causing a problem, and Dimitri was simply there to finish it. There was a different justification both in society and Dimitri's mind this time around, and he was more than happy to do his duty. He was as happy as he could have been, at the very least. Dimitri didn't want to have to fight his family. Even if he and Rufus didn't get along at the best of times, Dimitri knew his uncle was the only family he had left. The tragedy of Duscur had torn apart everything else he knew, and there was no way he could ever get any of that back. Rufus was the only person Dimitri could cling to as a fragment of the past that had been so mercilessly stolen from him, but that was no longer an option. For the sake of the people Rufus was trying to hurt, Dimitri had to fight. He wasn't looking forward to it, but he knew that was normal. How could anyone want to do something like this? He had a duty to his people. They finally knew the truth with certainty, and he was going to bring their whispers as screams onto the nation's stage. Dimitri somehow knew this wasn't going to be the end of it though. Rufus had rallied together lords from the western side of Faerghus to stand by his side, and even after all of this was over, Dimitri would need to contend with the fact that some of his supposedly loyal subjects had stabbed him in the back to side with the regent inciting a coup against the leading house of the country. The western lords would likely to go hide in a corner somewhere once this was all over, but Dimitri would remember their transgressions, and he knew it would all come back to bite him with time. Of course it would. There was no way out of this that didn't end in war. Fighting Rufus would nip it in the bud, but the weed would always grow again, and Dimitri had no idea what to do about it. The forces marching to the kingdom had stopped for the night to make camp, and Dimitri sat down on the floor of his tent with a heavy sigh. He knew the battle the following day wasn't going to be easy, but what other choice did he have but to fight? Rufus wasn't going to cower quietly no matter how afraid he was. Dimitri knew that all too well. Rufus had already dug his own grave, and he was just going to keep burying himself deeper in the earth as long as it meant he wouldn't have to admit to his own wrongdoing. That was a well-established pattern with him. No matter what, he would never be honest about his circumstances as a leader of the kingdom. Honesty would shake the foundations of everything the people had worked for, and Rufus knew the rules just as well as anyone. Dimitri knew he couldn't spare even a moment to think of what was going to happen after the battle ended, but his mind kept drifting in that direction anyway. He would have to step up and do something for the sake of his people and his country, but the details were hard to put a finger on. Perhaps Dimitri would need to ascend to the throne early. Originally, the plan had been for him to take over the kingdom after graduating from the officers' academy. That certainly explained why Rufus had chosen now of all times to attack. He knew the day was coming when Dimitri would take his place, and he wanted to stop his nephew before the time came. Dimitri wouldn't let that happen though. He had a duty to uphold, and if that meant striking down his uncle, then so be it. He may have been willing to suffer indignities and assassination attempts in private, but this was a very public affair, and as such, Dimitri wasn't going to give Rufus the chance to get away with it. He had to look after those around him, after all. That was what a prince did, and Dimitri was not one to shy away from his duty the way his uncle had so many times over the years. He had made his decision, and he would not forget it. When morning came, a war would break out in full. The opening notes of the horrifying lament had already been played, and Dimitri would be the one to finally bring it to silence. He didn't want to fight against his family, but as long as he had no other choice, he would do what he had to. After all, who was he to disturb the status quo? This was what was expected of him in a nation of tradition, and Dimitri would not be the one to break tradition. Morning came early and mercilessly. Dimitri hadn't slept well, but he knew that couldn't stop him. He got ready for the battle ahead carefully, measuring every action he made and every breath he took. He doubted he would ever truly be ready for this, but what other choice did he have? No matter how much he wanted to love his uncle, that ship had already sailed, and there was no way to bring it back to harbor. They had long since hit the point of no return, and Dmitri would not try to grasp in vain for a hope that was no longer there. Dmitri did his best to make himself look prepared for the battle, but that was much easier said than done. The skin beneath his eyes was even darker than usual, a signal of his lack of sleep the night before. No matter how hard he tried to comb his hair out, it always seemed to look a little bit disheveled. In a word, he hated it, but he had no idea how to fix it, so he remained silent. There was too much on the line for this battle for him to be too distracted. "Are you ready, Your Highness?" Dmitri turned at the sound of Rodrigue's voice. He had been so caught up in his own thoughts that he hadn't even realized he was no longer alone in his tent. Dmitri pressed a false imitation of a smile across his lips as he nodded. "As ready as I can be," he replied. He was trying his best to put on a good show with hopes that maybe if he lied well enough, he would start to believe that he was ready for this too. He knew it didn't work that way, but if he hoped enough, maybe that would change. It was all about maybe these days. "It's okay if you need a bit of time," Rodrigue told him. "I know this isn't what any of us wanted to do. Your uncle has chosen a strange time to try and stage a coup, and you have every right to need time to grieve what he has taken from you." "He declared war against you," Dmitri corrected with a frown. "I would say that you have much more reason to take a moment to yourself than I. In all honesty, I had a feeling it would come to this years ago." "That doesn't mean you're ready for it now," Rodrigue countered. "Even if you thought it would come to this, you don't need to be prepared. All of this is sudden. I can't help but wonder what's going through your uncle's head right now." "You wouldn't be the only one," Dmitri hummed. No matter how many times he went over it in his head, he always felt like there was something wrong, something he was missing. His uncle had chosen this time to strike seemingly because Dmitri was going to be gone at the officers' academy, but that didn't feel right either. This was all put together hastily and poorly, like something had spurred Rufus into action well before he was ready to attack. Dmitri knew this was planned to some degree a long time ago, but the details hadn't been smoothed out. The declaration of war was messy and much too sudden, and it left many questions unanswered for everyone involved. "I doubt he'll be willing to talk to us now though," Rodrigue frowned. "If he's willing to declare war, then we're well past the point of just talking. Everyone else is ready to march on the capital to seize him once and for all. We cannot allow him to get away with this," Dmitri said, his eyes growing dark with intensity and the promise of violence. "If that means fighting against him, then so be it." The truth of his words went unspoken. "If that means killing him, then so be it." Rodrigue just hummed, his eyes falling closed in contemplation. "We have a duty to protect the people of Fairgus from anyone who would threaten to do them harm," Dmitri continued. "He could hurt everyone in the capital if we don't rush straight toward him to defeat him. I won't let that happen. If that means fighting him, then so be it. He made his decision, and I know what must be done." "I understand, Your Highness," Rodrigue nodded. "If you decide that you need a moment during the battle, all you need to do is say the word. I imagine the rest of your classmates will understand should you need to take a break. Fighting family is the last thing anyone wants to do." "Thank you for the offer, Rodrigue," Dmitri replied, even though they both knew he wasn't going to be taking Rodrigue up on his suggestion. "But I know what needs to be done, and I will not shy away from it." Rodrigue watched Dmitri for a few moments before nodding. "Of course," he murmured. He started toward the entrance of the tent, and Dmitri followed him. "Everyone else is ready. All we need is to hear the word that it's time to set off." "I understand," Dmitri said. He followed Rodrigue out of the tent and out into the rest of the camp. Everyone was waiting for Dmitri to order his uncle's death. That was the truth of what Rodrigue had chosen to not say out loud. Still, Dmitri knew what he meant, and everyone else did as well. Saying the truth aloud felt like a curse, and it would rock the fragile peace all of them understood. This battle was going to shake everyone to their cores as it was, and Dmitri didn't want to make that any worse than necessary. It was a shame he didn't have a choice. Rufus had started this war though, and Dmitri was going to be the one to finish it, He knew what had to be done. Rufus had shattered the status quo and gone so far as to try and destroy the innocent people he was meant to rule over. Dmitri would do what he had to in order to fix this before it could get any worse. It may not have been what he wanted to do, but this was not his decision to make. The people demanded protection, and Dmitri would not shy away from that. He looked up to the sky, finding it bitterly bright for the darkness of the day's circumstances. He would face it all, though, for the sake of defending those who needed his help most. Rufus' decision would quickly prove itself to be the wrong one, and Dmitri would tear apart his false ideals before the sun set. Everyone was counting on him, after all. Fairgus was a place of tradition, and it was fragile. Rufus had broken it, but Dmitri would be the one to put it back together. That was the duty of a prince, after all. Chapter 17, Phantoms of Lions. Rufus Thierry Bladded was many things. It had been a few years now since he first rose to power by taking the place on the throne once held by his younger brother. In that time, he had been doing all he could for the sake of his own benefit, and the people had fallen by the wayside. He knew of the unfavorable rumors about him. He heard each and every word, but he refused to let it bother him when there was so much on the line. He had too much to focus on to be caught up in whispers of what others were saying about him. None of the people seemed to like Rufus very much. Even though the lords in the western part of the continent enjoyed his company well enough, or at least pretended to in a way that was vaguely convincing, their people still held the king with contempt. There was always someone who disliked him, and while some could say Rufus had gotten used to it over the years, he would disagree entirely. Instead, it felt like the longer he sat there on the throne, the more it was trying to tear him apart. It was on the verge of completely destroying him at this point, and his spiking anxiety was proof. Rufus Thierry Bladded was many things. He was paranoid, self-centered, and weak-willed. So when he received a letter from Dmitri describing the march on Fhirdiad, Rufus spent his time reading it and pacing the length of the room. Each word was met with a scornful glare from the Grand Duke, and by the time he was finished his hands were shaking with rage and terror. He should have known how to handle a mere boy, but instead, he knew the earth was waiting for the best chance to swallow him whole. The Duke has stamped out most of the troops who invaded Frildarius. As things stand, a clash on royal soil and eventually within the capital is inevitable. As you are the only bloodkin I have, my lord, I pray we might find a way to resolve this conflict peacefully. It was almost hilarious just how well Dmitri could play the part of a man. Rufus knew better than to believe it, but it was still impressive how effortlessly the act came to his nephew. Most would read a letter like that and genuinely believe he had good intentions. Rufus, however, was not most people. He knew just how vengeful and destructive Dmitri could be when left to his devices, and he refused to fall prey to his nephew next. Rufus Thierry Bladded was many things. Strategic and confident were not any of those things. He shredded the letter in a few violent tears once he had finished reading it, slamming the pieces onto a nearby table. What rubbish! He sings of conciliation, but I know a threat when I read it, he announced. Shouldn't you take better care of a letter from your dear nephew, my lord? Cornelia questioned. She was the only other person in the room, since she was the only one Rufus knew he could trust with his deepest concerns regarding Dmitri's upcoming charge. Cornelia was the one who had told him to start the civil war in the first place, as a matter of fact. She had whispered in his ear that this was the best course of action, and Rufus had believed her. Even when Dmitri's letter was a threat clear as could be, Rufus knew he had done the right thing. He needed to get Dmitri out of his life, and if that meant combat, then so be it. He's not expecting a reply. The creature means to slay me, Rufus told her. He resisted the urge to reach for the torn letter once again, just to rip the page again and again until there was nothing left. Your fear of Prince Dmitri runs deeper than I thought, Cornelia hummed. Her voice turned sour as she glanced up to Rufus, but since she was so good at hiding her true intentions behind those melodic words of her, she effortlessly got away with it. Even if Rufus was upset, he wouldn't have been able to protest. After all, he was many things, and cowardly was one of them. Oh, you shouldn't have missed your chance 4 years ago in Dusker, or 2 years ago during the suppression of the rebellion. That's twice you failed to kill him. I've learned my lesson. A lion's cub is still a lion, and one cannot slay a lion with a clumsy scheme, Rufus told her. He paused for a moment, staring down at the letter and imagining the way Dmitri must have looked when he wrote it. Afterward, he let out a sigh, the sound coming out miserable and stressed. It's those monstrous eyes, Cornelia. They terrify me. The boy is a vicious animal, yet he attempts to feign actual grief that we can't find common ground. The aberrance of it shakes me to my core. I understand completely, Cornelia assured him with a nod. She always seemed to understand him better than anyone else, and Rufus couldn't have possibly been more grateful for it if he tried. Rufus clenched his hands into fists, and they began to tremble. Every night since I killed my brother, I dream a lion is ripping out my throat, he confessed softly. And that boy. That monstrous boy. He's going to be the one to do it. That's all he's ever wanted. He speaks of wanting to get revenge on those responsible without realizing his own flesh and blood was behind it. Rufus had lived in fear for years upon years now, and while one would have expected time to make it easier to bear, that had not been the case at all. Instead, Rufus just felt worse as the years crawled on. He wanted to find peace, but there would be no peace for him as long as Dmitri was still alive. He didn't care what the people of Fairgus had to say about him as long as he was able to survive the wrath of his monstrous nephew. You'll run yourself ragged if you live your days in fear of revenge, Cornelia pointed out as she took a few steps toward him. You are meant to rule Fairgus and you have the power to make it so. Your royal army is the finest in the realm. And if I may be so bold, you also have me. She cast him a gentle smile, offering him the most reassurance anyone possibly could given the circumstances. As welcome as Cornelia's kindness was, it wouldn't be enough to completely assuage Rufus' fears. He needed something more, and he knew it. He let out a slow sigh, and when he looked down at his hands, he found them shaking even more than before. I'm so utterly tired, he confessed. Tired of being afraid, tired of what I've become. All of it. Rufus Thierry Bladded was many things. The most prominent among those things was afraid. It took a lot more effort than Cornelia would have liked to get Rufus to finally sleep after the stressful day he had been having. The army from the church would be on their doorstep come morning, but those in the capital had at least a few more hours to try and strategize for what was to come. That was Cornelia's job, and she did not take it lightly. She pulled herself into a private room off to the side of the castle and snarled to herself. Rufus' anxieties were frustrating to deal with, and she would need to keep pushing him until he finally went through with the attack. He was a coward, and while Cornelia had been using that to her advantage for years up to this point, she still hadn't fully mastered the skill. The primary reason for that was that Rufus frustrated her more than anyone else she had ever worked with. He was obnoxious, and no matter how much power he could provide her, it never felt like enough when placed beside the aggravation he brought to her life. All of this had been so sudden that Cornelia didn't know what to do when it came to planning. Thales had sent the order to the kingdom capital earlier in the week. Something was happening in the imperial capital, and he demanded that she move up her plans as soon as possible. Rufus had always been planning on assassinating his nephew to secure his place on the throne, but now, there was more to it. They had to act as soon as possible or risk being destroyed under the weight of whatever was happening in the imperial capital. The lack of information was among many things frustrating Cornelia tonight, and all she wanted to do was tear someone apart the same way Rufus had ripped the letter from his nephew to shreds. As long as that wasn't an option though, she would just think through everything she had been told by Thales. Granted, that still wasn't much, but it would at least give her something to pass the time with. Cleobulus, begin your attack at once. We're out of time. Claim the kingdom by any means necessary. You know what to do. Cleobulus. There was a name she hadn't heard or read in a long time. She had been disguised as Cornelia for so long that she had almost forgotten what it was like to be called by the name she loved more than anything in the world. It was a necessary evil if their plan was to go off without a hitch, but it still irritated her beyond imagination. Cornelia was necessary for everything to go the way it should have, but that didn't mean Cleobulus had to like it. She was desperate to find more information given the unfortunate circumstances and lack of answers presented to her when all of this began, but she knew she was out of time. There was no way she would be able to find everything she needed when the attack was this close. Something had happened in the imperial capital, and she would just have to let that emptiness be enough. She could come up with a plan to kill the prince. She had to. If she failed a mission like that, then how was she supposed to accomplish anything as part of their greater schemes? It would be such a pathetic piece of the plan to mess up. Cornelia let out a heavy, strained sigh before she retreated to her own room. She doubted she would be able to sleep much better than Rufus given the circumstances, but she would need to try. The attack to come would not be an easy thing to endure, and she needed to be ready for it. Inwardly, Cornelia cursed Thales with everything she had for not giving her enough time to prepare. He probably hadn't been given much of a choice but to throw her into this on such short notice, but that did little to lessen the tempest of rage in her stomach. She had to find a way out of this. No matter what it took, she would survive, and she would make sure that damned lion cub was finally put to rest through force. It was the only thing she could do, and she looked forward to it. Dmitri and the rest of the soldiers from the church marched toward the capital slowly but surely when dawn arrived. The prince would never admit this out loud, but he had been hoping his uncle would surrender. He didn't want to fight against the only flesh and blood he had left, but he knew he wouldn't have a choice. He needed to fight, and he needed to win. The people of the capital who had been caught up in the crossfire of this conflict were counting on him. Gilbert returned from his scouting mission just as the rest of the Blue Lions were starting to set up. He bowed his head deeply to Dmitri as he spoke, every word coming out heavy and remorseful. According to our scouts, the enemy has positioned their troops on the capital streets, he said, his voice weighed down by the pain he was sharing with his allies. So they can use the townsfolk as shields when we take the fight to them, Rodrigue finished for him. Gilbert offered a small nod but gave no other confirmation. Rodrigue let out a snarl. What cowards! Well, now that we know their strategy, our next move will be critical, Dmitri declared. His stomach churned with anxiety as the truth continued to sink in that, yes, he was going to have to fight his uncle. There was no way out of this now, and he would simply have to deal with that. A victory stained with people's blood achieves nothing. We'll need to move our forces swiftly, but with caution. Didu, has there been a reply from my uncle? Didu looked down solemnly. Nothing of yet. Dmitri hummed under his breath. I thought not. He had written the letter the night before as part of a desperate plea to get his uncle to surrender and stop all of this, but he hadn't been expecting a response. He had already known that if his uncle was dedicated to his cause to the point of starting a civil war, then he wasn't going to back down just because Dmitri had asked him to. They were well beyond that point, and Dmitri knew it as much as he hated it. The air was tense as Dmitri considered the battle to come, and Gilbert took a small step toward him. Your Highness, will you truly be able to strike Rufus down when the time comes? He asked. His words confirmed what Dmitri had already known. The rest of the group was worried about him. They knew how difficult it would be for Dmitri to fight against his only living family, and if he was willing to take it, they would offer him a way out. I will do what is required of me, Dmitri said simply. It wasn't exactly an answer, but it was the best thing he could offer at this point. What else could he say? That he was looking forward to killing his uncle and officially destroying the rest of the Blooded line? Of course he wasn't looking forward to it. He had no other choice though, and so, he would do what he had to. Preparations are complete, Your Highness, Ingrid declared. Her voice came out surprisingly strong and confident despite the fears clearly tearing at her core. None of them wanted to do this, but they knew there was no other choice. They had to make their peace with it whether they wanted to or not. The people are waiting for you, Dmitri. Let's not keep them any longer, Mercedes said next. Her eyes were overflowing with anxiety, but she didn't bother to hide it. They were well past that point, and she knew it. Dmitri resisted the urge to let out a long, miserable sigh. Instead, he distracted his tongue and lips by speaking. No, we'd best not. Felix groaned and rolled his eyes. You're our commander, yet you look like you're heading for a funeral. Could you maybe try not being so insufferable? He questioned bitterly. Everyone in the area shot him a look that begged him to be quiet, but Felix didn't give them a second glance, instead just glaring at Dmitri with all the vitriol in the world. Dmitri was more than used to this though, so he shook his head and forced himself to speak. Apologies for my demeanor. "I've more than a few things on my mind," he said, even though that was a grave understatement. "But very well. Let's begin our final war council." Everyone in the area nodded and gladly followed Dmitri a bit closer to the gates of Fhirdiad so they could discuss their strategy one last time. Dmitri paused for a moment, eyeing the streets of the city on the horizon. He knew his uncle was going to use the people as scapegoats and shields in the face of his violence. Rufus was a coward, and even though Dmitri didn't like to speak poorly of his family, he knew that to be true. Besides, what did it matter if Dmitri was speaking poorly of someone who had gone so far as to start a war over something false just for the sake of claiming the throne? Rufus didn't care about how many people he was going to hurt in the path of violence that sought Dmitri dead, and if the prince called that cowardice out for what it was, he was harming no one. Dmitri had seen this coming years ago, and he couldn't tell if that made it easier or much harder. He knew his uncle was going to try and stab him in the back eventually for the sake of getting a chance at securing the throne. Still, he had never imagined it would go this far. He had never thought his uncle's desperation would end with him acting as if he was happy to destroy their home as long as he was able to get what he wanted. It was too far for anyone to go, and the thought made Dmitri sick. That was all the more reason for him to put down this rebellion before it could spread further. The kingdom had already been split in half between those who supported Rufus and those who did not, and if Dmitri allowed this wound to fester, the division would only grow worse. It wouldn't be easy, but he would fight against Rufus, and he would win. There were too many people counting on him for him to even entertain the idea of backing down. Today, a lion cub would bite back at its superior, and Dmitri cared little. After all, that was what needed to be done. The first priority of the army was to secure the safety of the people in the capital. The decision made to accomplish this feat involved the Blue Lions splitting into two groups to seize the outskirts of town before they moved forward. That would give most of the residents time to go into hiding when they realized what was happening, and those who were close to Fhirdiad's borders would be warned quickly. It was hardly a foolproof solution, but the start of the fighting would at least be enough to show the townsfolk it was time to retreat. After all, none of them would want to stay in the streets with an open battle like that brewing. Dmitri was charged with leading one group while Rodrigue took charge of the other. Dmitri's party consisted of himself, Didu, Mercedes, and Gilbert, while Rodrigue looked after Felix, Sylvain, and Ingrid. The other kingdom knights allied with them filled in the gaps, and the Knights of Syros took up the rear. It was the best plan they had, and they would push through to bring it to success with all the strength they possessed. Even as they all settled into position, Dmitri forced himself to stay focused. A piece of him was so desperate to hesitate, to pull back and leave this be, but he knew that wasn't an option. Dmitri hated the idea of fighting his countrymen, but for the greater good, he needed to stop Rufus. If his uncle was intent on starting a coup and killing countless people in the process, then Dmitri would be there to stamp out the rebellion. If that meant fighting against people of his country, those he could have called allies in some better life, then he would deal with it. So be it. The decision had been made, and he would do what was necessary. "All right, everyone," Dmitri declared. "The battle awaits us. For the sake of those who have been caught up in this conflict, do what you must to end this as soon as possible. Fergus needs you." Dmitri didn't bother to mince words beyond that as he started walking toward the first stronghold, his spear pressed tightly between his fingertips. His knuckles were white from the tension of his grip, but since that was the best way for him to let out the stress of the current situation, he didn't bother to fix it. Instead, when the stronghold came into view, he swung his lance high and brought it down as quickly as he could. 3 enemy soldiers were sent reeling backwards from the force of the strike, and Didu and Gilbert were quick to follow that up with slashes of their own. The soldiers were left on the ground seconds later, and Mercedes looked down at them with a light wince at the bloodshed before turning her attention to the others in the stronghold. There weren't all that many fighters in the stronghold, all things considered, though Dmitri supposed that made sense. The strongest among the enemy forces were waiting deeper within the capital to ambush the army from the church. This battle and coup attempt may have been last minute and hastily put together, but Rufus still knew enough of basic strategy to have a plan in mind. As far as Dmitri was concerned, those near the outside of the city would be easy enough to push through. Rufus wasn't strategizing for the sake of keeping the intruders out of the city at this point. He knew it was just a matter of time before they got in, so instead, he was opting for a strategy of exhausting them. Even if they fought against mostly easy targets, the fighters from Gareg Mach would grow weary with time, and that would give him the perfect chance to swoop in and finish them off with his best. It was a game of endurance, and Dmitri could see it. The best way to stop a battle like this was to cut off the issue right at the head. And perhaps that meant cutting off Rufus' head along the way. Dmitri dodged a poorly aimed stab cast in his direction before pushing his spear forward and following it through. The soldier that had attacked him in the first place crumpled to the ground a moment later, and Dmitri didn't even spare his body a second glance. His previous sympathy had been forced to fall by the wayside in favor of the battle at hand. It was hardly pretty, nor was it something he took pride in, but he knew what needed to be done. Duty was a difficult beast to tame, but he had to try. An explosion of white magic rocked the stronghold a moment later, and a small cluster of soldiers was sent scattering from the force of the light. Mercedes lowered her hands a moment later, and Dmitri and Didu rushed forward with their weapons at the ready. A lance and axe swung in harmony to dispose of the soldiers Mercedes had struck, and Gilbert finished off any that had been left behind. The process had started and ended in a matter of seconds, and the only soldier that remained was the one looking over the stronghold as a whole. Dmitri wasted no time in rushing forward, his lance primed in front of him for an attack. Blood was left smeared across the ground seconds later as the stronghold's commander crumpled into the dirt. Just like that, the first outpost had been seized in the name of the army from the church. They had successfully secured their first foothold for the rest of the battle, and hopefully, it would help to lead them to the success they had been craving. On the other side of the city's entrance, Rodrigue, Felix, Ingrid, and Sylvain were having similarly good luck. The soldiers that confronted them posed very little in the way of a challenge, and the stronghold was seized in a matter of minutes. With the entrance to the city fully secured, the Blue Lions could charge ahead and do their best to aid the townsfolk before the fighting put them in even more danger. A few Knights of Syros could stay behind in either fortress to look after the newly gained territory and ensure there were no reinforcement assaults from behind. Dmitri and Rodrigue both led their groups forward once the respective strongholds had been seized, and the combined force of the Blue Lions and their escorts stood in front of the entrance to Fhurdiad proper. The streets were already overrun with soldiers, but if they acted fast, they could still do something to help those who were out and about. There were undoubtedly at least a few people who hadn't been able to escape the chaos before the fighting began, and Dmitri refused to leave them behind. His people were counting on him, and he would do everything in his power to help them no matter what it took. I see the Grand Duke has no intentions of holding back now that we've made our intentions clear, Rodrigue murmured. We should do our best to clear out the city before we turn our attention to the castle. I have no doubt he'll do everything he can to seal us in if we give him the chance to do so. Then we split up and clear everyone out of the city as soon as possible, Felix declared. We can tell the people to get inside while getting rid of any soldiers that decide they want to keep causing us problems. As long as we take this one step at a time, we'll be fine. We shouldn't go off on our own, Sylvain advised. No matter how strong we are, it won't mean much if we end up being surrounded and defeated before we have the chance to meet back up in front of the castle. We can move in pairs to make sure we don't end up completely cornered and destroyed. Felix nodded, knowing there was little point in arguing about this when there was so much on the line. He darted off before anyone had the chance to stop him, and Sylvain was quick to follow, a sigh on his lips from a mix of irritation and exhaustion. He was used to Felix behaving this way, but when the situation was as tense as it was, dealing with that was far easier said than done. Either way, the two were gone in a matter of seconds, leaving the rest of the group behind to work out their arrangements going forward. I can go with Lord Rodrigue, Ingrid said after a few seconds of watching the corner Felix and Sylvain had vanished around. We'll meet with you again in front of the castle. Do your best to stay safe until then, all right? I don't want anything bad to happen to any of you. We'll see you there, Ingrid, Mercedes assured her. Ingrid nodded hesitantly before she dashed off, Rodrigue prompting his horse into a trot after her. They were quick to round another street corner to travel deeper into the city, leaving only Dmitri, Didu, Mercedes, and Gilbert near Fhurdiad's entrance. Didu and I can go together, and that leaves you with Gilbert, Mercedes, Dmitri said. It was a cruel twist of fate that Mercedes, Annette's best friend, was being paired with Annette's father for the sake of this mission, especially after Gilbert had left his family behind years prior. Dimitri didn't know how Mercedes was going to react to that, but he knew there was no time to linger on it either. If Mercedes was at all bothered by this turn of events, she didn't show it, instead just nodding. Dimitri and Didier looked to one another and shared small nods before they moved toward Fhirdiad. They knew what needed to be done, and standing around and waiting for things to get worse wasn't going to help anything or anyone. As long as the people of Fargus were counting on them, they had to get moving. Mercedes dashed off without giving Gilbert a second glance, knowing that would only waste more precious time when there were people who needed to be saved. She didn't think she had much of anything kind to say to Gilbert in the first place. Even if Annette hadn't explicitly told her Gilbert was her father, Mercedes could figure it out easily enough. The two shared the same bright orange hair, and the facts of Gilbert being a knight with few connections to the outside world made it clear as could be who he was. Mercedes had heard just how much Annette had suffered after her father had left her behind. That alliance meant Mercedes was not going to forgive Gilbert so easily. They may have needed to work together for the sake of the mission, but Mercedes would remember everything he had done for better or worse. Mercedes had come to know Annette well since they first crossed paths, and she knew there was more to her absence in this battle than met the eye. Annette didn't want to see her father and speak with him before she was ready, and she most certainly didn't feel prepared yet. Mercedes knew Annette was afraid of seeing her father again, and she respected that decision. No matter what happened, Mercedes would do what she could for the sake of her friend, and if that strained her relationship with Gilbert, so be it. Either way, she had a job to do. Mercedes couldn't be caught up in matters of personal grudges no matter how close they hit to home for her. She needed to ensure this fight was won, and that started with defeating the soldiers of Itha and the others loyal to Rufus. The city and palace awaited, and Mercedes would help to save them both with time. She just hoped she wasn't too late to save those who needed her most. Chapter 18, Crisis in Fhirdiad. As was to be expected, the streets of Fhirdiad were completely overrun with soldiers by the time Dimitri arrived. He wove in between the enemies whenever he could to see if there were innocent townsfolk out and about, but there were luckily very few of them he needed to warn. For the most part, they had already been driven back into their homes when they realized what was happening. They had sensed a conflict was coming, and their best solution to that was to return to hiding as they had been before. Dimitri wondered if any of them had expected Rufus to stab them all in the back for the sake of his own gain. Beyond that, he was curious about if it even mattered. Dimitri swung his lance twice before stabbing forward, following his momentum toward the end of the encounter each time someone tried to get too close to him. Didier was there to deflect any attacks that came his way, and there were quite a few of those. Many of the soldiers were targeting Dimitri directly, and if he had to guess, he would have assumed that his uncle had instructed them to chase after him above all else. If they could claim the prince's head, then there would be no need to fight in the rest of the war, after all. It would hardly be a pretty outcome, but it wasn't as if Rufus was hoping for anything less. The longer the fight wore on, the more convinced Dimitri became that this really was meant to be a battle of endurance. He needed to be careful about conserving his energy so he didn't lose his strength before he arrived at the castle. There was no way of saying who else Rufus had convinced to side with him, and that meant Dimitri couldn't quite gauge who he was going to be up against. He would need to be patient and cautious above all else if he was to survive this onslaught. His people needed him, and he would not let them down. Dimitri pushed through another cluster of soldiers by slashing his lance outwardly. The men were sent flying backward clumsily, and Dimitri was quick to follow up by striking them down. He wanted to feel sympathy for them, but he couldn't bring himself to bother. These people had put their fellow countrymen in danger for the sake of following a person fueled by greed and violence. How could Dimitri ignore something like that when it could have so easily cost people their lives? Rufus was dangerous, and anyone who dared to side with him in a time like this was dangerous in all the same ways. The prince let out a heavy sigh as he heard the sounds of battle from up ahead. At first, he was wondering if perhaps the other groups had already managed to push through the streets and were preparing to rendezvous in front of the castle. However, he was too far away from the castle for that to be the case, and they would have had to move incredibly quickly for something like that to be possible. It didn't even feel possible. There had to be some other explanation. Sure enough, when Dmitri and Dida grew nearer, they were faced with the truth. A small group of kingdom soldiers, seemingly a faction loyal to Dmitri's claim to the crown, had gathered together in the street, and they were fighting off as many enemy fighters as possible. It was a losing battle though, and they wouldn't be able to last for much longer. They needed help, and Dmitri was more than happy to provide it. Upon seeing this, Dmitri rushed forward, his lance following him ahead. He struck one of the enemy soldiers in the back with a stab, and the man crumpled to the ground. Dmitri ignored the way blood seeped into the cobblestones of the streets and stepped over the corpse to strike at another pair of soldiers coming in his direction. He was as quick as he could have been in pushing back the other soldiers for the sake of reaching his allies. He needed all the help he could get, but beyond that, he wanted to help those who needed him most. Dmitri hadn't been there to help his people when all of this began, but he was determined to change that. He owed it to them to help. The kingdom soldiers' strength and energy seemed to restore itself the instant they realized just who had come to their rescue. Previously, they had been losing the will to fight under the onslaught that surrounded them, but that all changed when Dmitri arrived. The prince was happy to be able to help, and he pushed through each of the soldiers harassing his allies with elegant ease. Rufus really had sent out his weakest allies first for the sake of wearing down Dmitri's energy. Unfortunately, trying to wear away at Dmitri's strength wasn't going to help him in the long run. There was too much on the line, and Dmitri would not be pushed into compliance so easily. It took a few more minutes, but eventually, the enemy soldiers attacking the kingdom fighters had been cleared out. The square was mostly empty now, and Dmitri glanced around for a few moments just to make sure they were in the clear. When he saw nothing, he let out a small sigh. He wouldn't be able to let his guard down for long, but he at least had a moment to rest and catch his breath before he needed to move on. "I'm sorry, Your Highness," one of the guards exclaimed as they took a step closer to Dmitri. "If we had known it would come to this, we would have done something more. My deepest apologies for—" "You don't need to apologize for anything," Dmitri assured them with a shake of his head. "The situation is grim, and you had no idea you were going to be attacked by the Grand Duke. Now, the best we can do is try to push forward. It won't be easy, but we need to try." The kingdom soldier nodded, unable to bring himself to say much else. He gestured for the others in his group to follow him as he started to charge through the enemy line. Dmitri watched the cluster of fighters run off, though they were headed back where they had come to warn the people who needed it. Dmitri was glad to see that, especially since he knew he couldn't stretch himself too thin as long as he was needed in the castle. He couldn't falter before his uncle no matter how desperate he was to run away, and that meant pressing forward with everything he had. Dmitri glanced around carefully to see if there were any other townsfolk in the area, but when he saw nothing, he continued to rush forward, though he was careful to not run at his full speed. That was just asking for his energy to be depleted prematurely, and that was the last thing he could afford when he had no idea what Rufus had in store for him in the castle. There was no way of saying how many kingdom nobles had allied themselves with the Grand Duke, and that meant Dmitri would need to wait and see how many people he needed to fight against. The uncertainty would have bothered most people, but as far as Dmitri was concerned, this was just a natural part of conflict. He needed to be ready for anything regardless of how fierce his opponents were. Rufus wasn't counting on him to survive the full force of the army he had pulled together, but Dmitri was determined to prove him wrong no matter what it took. He would save the people of Faerghus. If Rufus tried to get in his way, he would simply have to pay the price. Rufus knew it the instant Dmitri had arrived. He stood in the castle looking out the window, his hands pressed together behind his back. His knuckles were tense and white from gripping so tightly at his fingers, and his breathing was labored from pure, unfiltered stress. His heart had been pounding ever since he felt the tides of conflict shift with the arrival of a new fighting force. His head hurt to no end under the weight of his fear and paranoia, and all he wanted to do was run and hide until it was over. But he had no option but to stand his ground, did he? If Rufus ran, that would just give up the throne to his nephew, and that was one thing he refused to do above all else. He had fought and killed to reach the throne, and he wouldn't give it up no matter what. Lambert had taken the throne from him years ago, and Dmitri would do the same if he was given the chance. Rufus refused to allow him the opportunity. He would not falter. He couldn't falter. A soldier darted in to say the army from the church had arrived, and the Grand Duke was quick to dismiss him. Rufus didn't need to hear that from someone else. He could feel his nephew drawing nearer, and his neck was beginning to hurt from the pressure. It was just a matter of time before Dmitri arrived on his doorstep to tear his throat from his body the same way Rufus had feared for so many years. There was no escape no matter how desperate he was to run. His nephew was coming to try and kill him. Even if Rufus managed to get away with his tail between his legs and the throne abandoned, he would die soon enough. Dmitri would find a way to track him down, and he would perish. Rufus' body shook the longer he thought about it. Cornelia had told him this was what he needed to do, and he had believed it. Cornelia knew what was best, and Rufus had full confidence that her judgment was correct. She wouldn't have pushed him into this if it wasn't for the best. She was out there fighting as he stood there thinking about it. It was twisted, and he despised it. All he could do was wait for his nephew to arrive no matter how awful it made him feel. Rufus was fully aware this could have been the last day he drew breath, and his nightmares were making sure he understood the brutality of the situation. Each blink he made reminded him again and again of how horrifying it would be to die at the hands of his nephew, to have his blood spilled the same way he had spilled his brother's blood during the tragedy of Dusker. The lion was coming to tear his throat from his body, and no matter how desperate he was, there would be no escape. He had no choice left but to face his fate, and that meant death coming for him at last. Rufus shook his head. There was still hope. Of course there was still hope. He had a massive army fighting at his side, and even if Dmitri fought like a man possessed, that wouldn't be enough to fight through a massive onslaught of soldiers. He would be outnumbered in time, and Rufus would ensure he was defeated by the army he had amassed. That was the only chance Rufus had for survival, after all, and he refused to back down if it meant he could live. He had to wonder if perhaps this was all some mistake. Rufus had been planning on starting a coup to overthrow his nephew while Dmitri was at the officers' academy, but this had all come too soon. He hadn't planned out the battle well enough, and the short notice had caught everyone off guard. While that put his enemy at a disadvantage, that also meant Rufus' army was left struggling and fumbling for purchase. He should have waited longer and tried to plan out the details more. Moving quickly and desperately had only earned him the ire of half the kingdom and the church in one fell swoop. The excuse of Dmitri being treated as a puppet by House Frildarius was flimsy as well, and anyone who thought about it for longer than a few seconds would see the truth for what it was, a bold-faced lie hidden behind a thin veil of treachery and deceit. Only those who were biased toward Rufus as it was believed in his words, and that was bound to fall apart in a matter of minutes if the townspeople got involved. They loved Dmitri and hated Rufus. The Grand Duke had never been at a greater disadvantage. If he was fighting despite all this, perhaps Rufus deserved to have his throat ripped from his neck by the cub of a lion. He had been clumsy and foolish, and he was feeling the consequences of his hasty desperation already. It was just a matter of time before it caught up to him in full, and when the time came, his world would be consumed by bloodshed and death. Cornelia had told him this was for the best though. It was just a matter of time before Dmitri came after him, and even if this had been clumsy and haphazard, it was still necessary. Rufus would need to do this eventually, and Cornelia had told him it would be all right. He needed to have faith in her. Cornelia had never led him astray before now, and Rufus wouldn't dare to insinuate she would betray him after all they had been through. They had worked together for years, after all. She had helped him to orchestrate the tragedy of Dusker when he had been afraid of what it meant to kill his brother. She had guided him throughout his entire rule, and Rufus believed she knew what she was doing. He kept repeating over and over that Cornelia knew what she was doing. It was just about the only fact that was able to calm his nerves, and even then, it was a half-hearted attempt to soothe himself in the face of danger. It was the best Rufus had though, and he was going to take it for what it was regardless of how difficult it was. He would be fine. He had to be. He closed his eyes and saw Dmitri running toward him with his spear in hand. When Rufus opened his eyes again, he could see the chaos in the city streets down below, and he swallowed back his nerves. The day was going to end in death for someone. He would just need to wait and see who fell when the final stab was made. Rufus' hands continued to shake, and he could have sworn he felt the fangs of a lion digging into his neck as his breath abandoned his lungs. Felix darted quickly through the enemy forces, his sword always primed at the ready. His skills with evasion had proved themselves invaluable since the battle began, and he dodged a slash coming down toward his head before striking upwards with his own blade. The soldier that had dared to attack him in the first place was cast aside a moment later, and Felix didn't even bother giving him a second glance. He knew what needed to be done, and he couldn't afford to hesitate now. Just to hammer the point home more, Felix slashed outward at 3 soldiers, knocking them all to the ground before he followed up with another set of stabs. As soon as that was finished, he kept moving through the crowd, his blade bloodied as it followed him forward. Sylvain let out a sigh as he tried to catch up with Felix, shaking his head along the way. Felix was fast, and while he had come to know this years ago, it still found new ways to catch him by surprise. The battle in Ferdiad had sparked a new fire in Felix's eyes though, and Sylvain didn't think he had ever seen his old friend looking quite this desperate and full of rage. Felix wouldn't have ever admitted it if he was asked, but Sylvain knew him well enough to figure that out on his own. Whether he wanted to admit it or not, Felix was nervous about everything that had happened. He was afraid of the ways in which the conflict against Rufus could manifest, especially since it had already brought disaster to his home territory. If the Blue Lions didn't end the fight then and there, Felix would be left to deal with the consequences for years to come. Even if they managed to win, the aftermath of Rufus' gambit would linger in history. A schism had opened down the center of the kingdom's territory, and the nobles in the west and east were bound to break into conflict again if given the chance. Calamity was coming, and they could feel it. And Felix knew it better than anyone. He fought with all the force and vitriol in the world, his blade constantly primed for stabs and slashes when any soldiers tried to cross him. It was impressive just how easily Felix could walk through the different clusters of enemy fighters, and Sylvain would have told him as much if it wouldn't have been a distraction from the matter at hand. Unfortunately for Felix's ego though, he knew better than that, so he instead turned his attention to pushing through the enemy lines. If they wanted to win this fight, they needed to stay focused. Thanks to Felix's brazen determination, he and Sylvain were able to reach the space in front of the castle fairly easily. Rufus had sent most of his weaker soldiers to take care of the city itself while his stronger allies stood at his side in preparation for an upcoming attack. He knew what was coming, and he was waiting for it. If it was a fight Rufus was waiting for, then that was exactly what he was going to get. Much to Sylvain's surprise, Dimitri, Didu, Ingrid, and Rodrigue were already waiting for him when he arrived at the front of the castle. Only Mercedes and Gilbert had yet to meet them there. When Sylvain noticed this, he let out a sharp whistle. "You all sure work fast, huh?" he asked. "We have a lot to take care of, Sylvain," Ingrid pointed out, ignoring his whistle to stay focused as per usual. She didn't even spare him a brief glare in response to his offhand comment. "We can't afford to wait any longer than we already have. We've cleared out the town, so the best thing we can do is charge in there and stop him once and for all. Our next course of action should be to split up and lower the drawbridges on either side of the castle so we can get inside," Dimitri declared. He glanced over to the castle gates, frowning when he was met with massive steel bars rather than the massive doors leading into the palace. "My uncle has barricaded himself inside the castle. He hopes to exhaust us by leaving us with so many soldiers for an extended period. It will take time and energy for us to get inside, but if we are to stop him, then we need to break in. So we're back to splitting up," Sylvain concluded, not that he was surprised to hear it at all. "I guess we don't have much of a choice, huh? What are we doing?" Mercedes' voice cut through the crowd, and she dashed up to the group in front of the castle gates. Gilbert lagged behind her, his axe still primed at the ready in case anyone tried to take him by surprise. When nobody caught up with him though, he allowed his guard to fall for a few brief moments. "We need to divide into 2 groups for the sake of opening both side gates to the castle," Rodrigue explained. "The sooner we can lower the drawbridges, the sooner we can reach the Grand Duke and defeat him ourselves." "Then let's go," Mercedes declared. "We were able to clear out our segment of the town easily enough, and every person who was out and about has now been returned safely to their homes. We're free to rush into the castle now. In that case, the 2 of you can come with me and Didu as we go to the west," Dimitri declared. He turned his attention to Rodrigue a moment later. "You can lead everyone else to the eastern drawbridge. We can invade the castle together once both paths have been open. I doubt my uncle will be able to escape in time no matter how quickly he realizes our plan. Of course, Your Highness, Rodrigue nodded. He started to lead his horse away, but he paused a moment later. I would ask that you be careful though. Don't rush into any unnecessary danger, all right? Dmitri simply nodded. Of course. I'll look forward to meeting with you again when we arrive inside the castle. You had best do all you can to stay safe as well. I'm counting on all of you. Dmitri started off a few moments later, the other three from his group quickly following his lead. Rodrigue let out a small sigh to ground himself before glancing back to Felix, Ingrid, and Sylvain. All right, you three. We had better be ready for anything when we go to open that other drawbridge. I imagine that opening the gate to the castle will bring all the stronger soldiers flooding out to try and defeat us, he declared. If they'll give me more of a challenge, I invite them to try, Felix muttered crossly. He was back to running off into the fray a moment later, not sparing even a glance in the direction of his allies. Sylvain wished he could have been surprised, but this was just a natural piece of Felix's behavior as far as he was concerned. He just shook his head and trailed after Felix as soon as he got a grip on himself once again, counting on Rodrigue and Ingrid to follow him. Just as Felix and Rodrigue had claimed, the stronger soldiers were waiting for them the closer they got to the drawbridge mechanism. Sylvain was already starting to feel the pull of exhaustion, but most of that was from running rather than fighting. Since the enemy forces were growing stronger, Felix couldn't rush ahead, and that meant Sylvain didn't need to dash after him the same way he had previously. Sylvain took this as a blessing and thanked Felix for having mercy on him as he stabbed forward with his lance. He watched his enemy fall before moving on, knowing there was no time for him to linger on what he was being forced to do. He had a mission to resolve first and foremost, and he would see it completed no matter what. If he was being honest, Sylvain had expected it to come to this sooner or later. He was no fool, and he knew enough of politics to be fully aware that Rufus would not be able to escape the consequences of his actions forever. He was a poor ruler, and everyone in Faerghus knew it even if they were too polite to voice their discontent and risk violating the status quo they had come to know and love so well. It had just been a matter of time until Rufus' bad publicity came back to bite him. Sylvain hadn't expected Rufus himself to be the one to speed himself into this conflict though. He would have thought even Rufus would be smarter than that, though he supposed he shouldn't have raised his hopes too high for someone like that. The entire gambit reeked of desperation, but Sylvain couldn't quite put a finger on where it had come from. He liked to think of himself as politically savvy, but there was an element to the current conflict that remained indecipherable to him. Something had probably forced Rufus' hand, and the excuse of House Frildarius using Dmitri as a puppet had just been a convenient scapegoat for him to cite as the source of his rage. It was a poor excuse nobody bought unless they allowed themselves to willingly tune out the senselessness to the declaration, but it had still caused enough trouble to nearly spark a civil war. It was certainly a sign of something when it came to Faerghus' internal workings, but Sylvain didn't bother himself with the details. There was too much for him to focus on at the moment anyway. It didn't take long for Sylvain's group to push through to the stronghold where the drawbridge mechanism was waiting. Felix's confidence motivating him to run headlong into battle led the way forward, and Ingrid and Sylvain followed him while Rodrigue took up the rear to take care of any lingering enemies that planned on giving them trouble from behind. All things considered, it was a simple process, no doubt a prelude to what was bound to be a far more difficult battle when the group arrived in the palace to face off against Rufus and his personal guards from Itha. Sylvain dashed over to the mechanism while Felix and Rodrigue took care of the commander in the stronghold. Ingrid stood at Sylvain's side to guard him from any potential attacks, and she glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. "Are you ready?" she questioned even though there wasn't much room for Sylvain to respond in the negative. "As ready as I'll ever be," Sylvain said simply. He reached for the switch and pulled on it, finding it to be a lot harder to move than he would have expected. Either way, it got the job done, and the gateway leading into the castle opened itself gladly as Felix and Rodrigue cast aside the last of the soldiers in the fortress. Sylvain listened carefully and heard the sound of loud creaking somewhere in the distance. He knew that meant the other drawbridge was being lowered, and that was his cue to charge right into the castle along with the rest of his group. He had no idea what was waiting for him inside, but he would figure it out soon enough. Sylvain was sure of one thing though, Rufus wouldn't know what was coming for him until it was too late. Rufus was afraid. The Grand Duke paced the length of the throne room, doing his best to hold back whimpers of terror. They were almost there. The Blue Lions had managed to lower both drawbridges, and that meant it was just a matter of time before they figured out where he was and came for his head. Dmitri was going to rip his throat out the same way he had feared for years now. There would be no coming back from this. Rufus was as good as dead. He could feel it. The last few years had all been building up to this moment, and they were going to kill him before he knew what to do to retaliate. Cornelia, on the other hand, was perfectly calm from where she stood nearby. "Perhaps the time has come for us to intercept them personally," she suggested. Rufus was on the verge of questioning her about how easily she could speak when he felt like he was suffocating, but he couldn't force the words out, so he remained silent. "We can face them ourselves and ensure they fail. Are you ready?" In all honesty, Rufus didn't have an answer to that. How could he be ready for this knowing it could have so easily ended with his death? He had seen that horrifying image of his own murder in his dreams every night for years now, but he was never quite able to get used to the picture that presented itself to him in the dead of night. He wanted to live, damn it, and the idea of dying then and there made him feel sick to his stomach. But he knew there was no way out for him. He would need to push through and fight. Rufus had started this fight, and the time had come for him to finish it. He had no idea what to expect down the road ahead, but he would see with time. No matter what, this would be the day it all ended. The tragedy of Duscur had set all of this in motion, and everything was about to come crashing down to suffocate him at the bottom of the grave he had dug for himself so long ago. Rufus nodded slowly. No matter what, the farce he had been living out would end today. He didn't know how he could be ready for it, but one way or another, it would end. Either he would succeed and claim the throne for himself without a shadow of a doubt, or he would fail and be forced to kneel before his nephew as he offered his head. The grave he had dug years prior was waiting for him, and he would either end up at the bottom or abandon his uncle in it instead. Either way, this was the end. "Let's go," Rufus said simply. The words were distant and far away, coming through to his ears only after being filtered through the pounding of his own heart in his head. He shook off his nerves though as he reached for his blade and shield. He wouldn't go down without a fight. No matter how strong his nephew was, Rufus would fight back, and he would do everything in his power to ensure his own survival. He blinked for a moment, and he saw his head fall from his shoulders. He was barely even surprised by the image. That idea had lost its shock value long, long ago. All that remained was to see if it would come to fruition or not. Chapter 19, Confessional. Once both of the drawbridges had been lowered into place, a new charge began. Dimitri's grip on his lance grew a little bit tighter, and he glanced to the rest of his group carefully. They would be able to meet up with the others once they entered the castle, and when they did, they would no doubt run into a new enemy. Rufus was waiting for them, and Dmitri knew what needed to be done. He did not look forward to what had to come next, but he knew what his next step had to be. "Are you ready, Your Highness?" Dida questioned when Dmitri hesitated for a second too long. The answer was obviously no. Dmitri didn't want to have to fight his family, the only relative he had left, but he knew there was no other choice. Rufus had made his decision, and he would have to live with it for the rest of his brief existence. He had every opportunity to stop this, but since he chose not to, the Blue Lions would simply have to put him in his place. And right now, that place was in the ground under an unceremonious headstone to mark his treachery. With that in mind, Dmitri nodded. "Let's go," he said simply. He dashed forward soon afterward, and Dida trailed after him. Their next stop was the heart of the castle where Rufus was bound to be waiting for them. Dimitri's heart pounded in his ears both from hate of his circumstances and eager anticipation for the battle to come. He would finally be able to lay his uncle low and end the attempts on his life. He would be able to save the people of the capital who had been forced to suffer under Rufus' recent declaration of civil war. He would be able to help everyone who had ever criticized Rufus' rule ever since the death of Lambert in the tragedy of Duscur. At long last, peace was within his grasp. Or, at the very least, that was what Dmitri had been expecting. Instead, the one that met his gaze when he first stepped into the castle was Cornelia. She had a tome pressed between her fingers and a frown on her face, apathy written clear as could be in her eyes. "I underestimated you, I see," Cornelia murmured. "I had been hoping the army would be enough to stop you, but it seems I was wrong. So be it. I'll simply have to put you in your place myself." Dmitri wasn't surprised in the slightest to see Cornelia here at his uncle's side. If anything, it made perfect sense. Cornelia had been Rufus' primary advisor ever since he first ascended to the throne, and more importantly, her worst side had come rearing its ugly head once she was allowed to stand at his side. Cornelia had changed suddenly many years ago, her previous kindness replaced with a poorly masked brutality, but she hadn't even bothered with hiding the truth once she was promoted even further by Rufus. She owed her current status to him in every way imaginable, and she would not allow herself to forget it. "You have one chance to step aside lest we be forced to cut you down," Dmitri said simply. He already knew Cornelia wouldn't back down, but he at least wanted to give her the option. He had come here expecting Rufus, and the fact that she insisted on standing in his way was, at best, irritating. She could either step away from the battle then and there, or she could face the consequences that came with facing him in a battle. Cornelia let out a small snicker that told Dmitri everything he needed to hear. "You can try to cut me down all you want, but you will find it much harder than you would have thought," she told him. She flicked open her tome, and flames immediately burst from her fingertips to soar through the air toward the prince. Dmitri rolled out of the way just in time, and the fire instead slammed into the stone wall just behind him. "I do not intend on surrendering quite so easily." "So be it," Dmitri murmured under his breath. He launched himself forward with his spear primed at the ready, and he stabbed in her direction with as much force as he could muster. Cornelia barely managed to slip out of the way, but she wasn't prepared for the upward cut that Dmitri followed up with. She let out a strangled cry as she stumbled backward, leaving her as the perfect target for Felix's blade. Rodrigue's party had arrived at the scene of the battle while Dmitri was distracted with Cornelia, and Felix was the first to make himself known by cutting at Cornelia with all his strength. Cornelia raised her tome high in preparation to cast another spell, but she was cut off when Ingrid sent her spear flying at the mage's hand. The lance was not a javelin, but it still accomplished its duty well enough when thrown, and Cornelia's tome fell to the ground with a resounding echo. She hissed under her breath as she forced herself into a crouch to retrieve it, but Mercedes was ready for her. A blast of white magic swiftly caught Cornelia off guard, once again sending her backwards. The mage slid across the stone floor of the castle, her shoes leaving behind small skid marks. Ingrid retrieved her lance as Sylvain lunged forward with his own spear to cut at Cornelia. She couldn't quite dart away this time due to the previous hits she had sustained, and she wrapped an arm around her stomach in the wake of Sylvain's stab. He hadn't opened a particularly deep wound, but it was still more than enough to catch her by surprise. She knew she wouldn't be able to escape this battle as easily as she would have liked, and her panic was mounting as a result. Cornelia concentrated her energy into a column of dark magic that rocked the castle floor, and Sylvain and Ingrid were both sent flying backward from the sheer force. The attack was lazily placed though, more meant to be a distraction than anything else. In fact, Sylvain and Ingrid suffered more damage from hitting the nearby wall than from the magical blast itself. Still, it was enough to leave them both dazed, and Mercedes and Rodrigue were quick to come to their defense with healing magic at the ready. The two lance-wielders offered them weary smiles but said nothing, knowing they couldn't afford the distraction in the midst of the battle. While Cornelia was distracted with trying to get Sylvain and Ingrid off her back, Dmitri charged at her from behind, mustering as much strength as he could into his spear. He swung into her wounded side, and Cornelia let out a cry of agony as she was sent sprawling across the room. She landed on the ground in a heap, and Felix went in for the killing blow in the form of a stab to the chest. Cornelia summoned a blast of fire just in time to send his sword off course, and the blade embedded itself into the floor just beside her instead of striking true in her chest. Dmitri was quick to try and finish her from there, raising his spear high for another downward slice. His crest flickered in the air behind him, strengthening his attack and then some. Cornelia threw up her tome in an attempt to block the attack, but there was only so much she could do to mitigate the damage. She slammed into the wall a moment later, and her body went limp as her wounds made themselves apparent. Blood was seeping in through the rips in her dress, proof of the damage she had sustained since the beginning of the battle. Despite it all though, Cornelia still had a smile on her face. The grin was strained and crumbling at the edges, but she was still grinning, and it was more than enough to catch Dmitri by surprise as he loomed over her fallen form. "Look at me. Getting wrapped up in my own fun again," Cornelia murmured. Before Dmitri had the chance to ask what she was talking about, Cornelia shook her head. "But I'm afraid this is where I must bid you farewell. Goodbye, little prince." Dmitri barely had time to throw his hands up to cover his eyes as a sudden flash of light filled his vision. He blinked rapidly in an attempt to dispel the spots that had quickly come to consume his field of vision, but when he got a grip on reality once again, Cornelia was gone. He glanced around in a desperate bid to find her, but he already knew he would see no traces of her. She had taken advantage of the chaos to vanish, and she was off planning her next move, if Dmitri had to guess. She was a slippery woman when she wanted to be, and right now, she was desperate to escape above all else. The Blue Lions were the ones left to deal with the consequences of that cowardice though. "She's gone," Felix scoffed to himself. "Searching for her won't do us any good. We came here for the Grand Duke, and he's bound to be around here somewhere. We just have to find him." Felix flicked his blade once, and a few specks of blood flew off the sword before splattering on the ground. He let out a heavy sigh before he continued to charge forward, ready to cleave through any other soldiers that dared to stand in his way. Dmitri wanted to tell Felix that everything would be fine, but in all honesty, he had no way of knowing for sure. Cornelia and Rufus must have been planning something if she was so happy to retreat. She hadn't released her full power during that battle, and every single one of them knew it. It was almost as if she had known she would be bested and had planned a backup plan accordingly, and for the moment, that backup plan involved fleeing from the scene of the fight and waiting until a better time to strike arrived. Dmitri had no idea what that meant for him, but he had the sneaking suspicion he would find out soon enough. Unfortunately, he wouldn't have much time to think about it at the moment. Waves of soldiers were converging upon him from all directions, each of them with their blades at the ready. Rufus had left his strongest defenders for the inside of the castle, and with Cornelia out of the picture, they had no choice but to strike. It barely surprised Dmitri at all to see Rufus throwing so many soldiers at the Blue Lions. If anything, it was just proof of how cowardly the Grand Duke truly was. He wouldn't stand his own ground in a fight that he had started as long as he could send others to win the battle for him. It would not end until he was dead, but he would run from that fate for as long as his legs would be willing to carry him. Felix barely even spared the new arrivals a roll of his eyes as he slashed at them with his blade. His sword traveled in a wide arc that sent many soldiers flying backwards from the force as his crest flickered in the air behind him. Sylvain and Ingrid, who had recovered since being hit with Cornelia's earlier flare, were quick to follow up on the enemies Felix left behind. Rodrigue and Gilbert split up to take out the other soldiers attempting to flank the Blue Lions from the drawbridge paths they had initially come through, and Mercedes offered support to Rodrigue with her explosions of white magic. Didier remained as close to Dmitri as he could, and the leader of the Blue Lions made a mental note to once again thank Didier for his service once the battle was over. It was the least he could offer as far as he was concerned. Dmitri could already tell the enemy guards were growing stronger, but he refused to let that stop him. He followed the momentum of his lance forward, and Didier slashed off to his right with his axe. Anyone who dared to cross them was disposed of in a matter of seconds. Even the strongest among Rufus' soldiers was forced to cower before the might of the Knights of Syros, the Crown Prince, and those who followed him. There were simply too many enemies for the Western Lord's forces to withstand, and every single one of them knew it. The clock was slowly ticking down to the moment of Rufus' demise. He had done well to survive this long, but his luck was bound to run out soon enough, and when it did, well, Dmitri would do what he had to. That was what he had promised the people of his country. Even if it put him against his family, he would do what was necessary. What else was a prince meant to do when faced with the treason of the man who came before him? Rufus' hands shook where they gripped at his axe. All things considered, he wasn't surprised Cornelia had been defeated. He had wanted to believe with everything he had that she would be strong enough to fend Dmitri off and eventually kill him, but Rufus knew better than to be caught up in his beliefs to the point of blocking out reality. Cornelia was strong, but when Dmitri put his mind to something, nothing could stop him. He fought like an animal, all primal instincts and rage. No matter what, he would find a way to win any battle he found himself involved with. He was a cub, but he was still a lion, and lions did not bow to anyone. Even as Rufus stood there, his nephew was preparing all the ways in which he could kill him. Dmitri was already cleaving through Rufus' forces at breakneck speeds, readying himself for the final blow above all else. The blue lions were strong, but Dmitri barely even felt human when compared to the rest of his allies. He was too powerful for his own good. He could tear the world apart if he so chose, and Rufus could feel that was what the future held. How could a beast rule a kingdom to begin with? Rufus knew what the people thought of him and how much they despised his rule, but he was confident it had to be better than anything Dmitri could have done. This would be the day that decided it all. By the time the sun fell on the horizon, Rufus, or Dmitri, would be dead. The Grand Duke already knew the way it was going to end. No matter how far he tried to run, he would not escape. His fate had already been sealed. Cornelia's defeat had simply made it clear to him that there was no way out. If there had been a doubt, all his uncertainty had faded the instant Cornelia was forced to retreat. Rufus was going to die. However, he would not go down without a fight. As long as there was a chance for him to win, he would have to put in the effort. The chances of his success were slim, yes, but Rufus had to give it everything he had regardless. He tightened his grip on his axe despite the way his fingers trembled readily and fearfully. He needed to try. He had to. What else was there left for him? Dmitri didn't hesitate for even a moment as he rushed toward Rufus, his spear raised high above his head. Rufus threw his shield up haphazardly in an attempt to minimize the damage, but that only did so much for him, especially when Dmitri's crest flashed its warning sign behind him. Rufus snarled at the sight. If he had been born with a crest, then none of this would have happened. He would have been the king instead of his brother, and there wouldn't have needed to be a tragedy in the first place for him to claim the power he deserved from the start. It was all because of that damn crest. Rufus slid backwards and tried to use his shield to slow his inevitable fall to the ground, but it did little to help him. Instead of collapsing fully though, Rufus' back hit the nearby wall, and he pushed himself up to his full height just before Dmitri could swing at his head. The lion cub fought with a ferocity beyond what Rufus had expected even for a beast as cruel as he. In a way, it was impressive, but it was terrifying just the same. Dmitri stabbed forward to try and pierce the space off to the side of Rufus' shield. His uncle tried to deflect the strike, but Dmitri's raw strength knocked him off his feet in the blink of an eye. Rufus let out a cry of pain as he slammed into the ground below, his shield lost in the scuffle. He was left to stare up at his nephew with wide, terrified eyes. He was cornered, and he could feel it. However, Rufus still had an axe in his other hand, and when Dmitri tried to strike at him once again, Rufus lashed out upwards with as much force as he could in his prone, weakened state. The strike was lazy and nowhere near as strong as it needed to be, but it still did something, and Dmitri was forced backwards once again. Rufus scrambled to his feet, but he didn't bother with trying to reclaim his shield. He couldn't do it, especially when he had so little time. Dmitri would destroy his defenses even if he tried to keep himself safe. Dmitri was simply too strong, and Rufus had never been made for the battlefield. He was politically savvy, but he was no good in a fight. There was a reason he had sent others in to kill his brother rather than participating in the assassination himself. Dmitri struck at Rufus with a speed unlike anything the Grand Duke had ever seen, and before he knew it, he was on the ground once again. Dmitri looked at him with a frown on his face and an imitation of mercy in his eyes. "I had long hoped for a day we might finally see eye to eye," he began. Rufus let out a scoff, his fear finally hitting a new peak as he glared up at his nephew. Every rage-filled thought that had crossed his mind since his first failure to kill Dmitri all those years ago came rushing out in a tidal wave before he could even think of holding himself back. Foolish child. A man and a monster can never come to common purpose. What right do you have to rule over men when you're barely human yourself? You're an aberration, nothing more. I should have killed you at Dusker when I had the chance. Dmitri's eyes went wide as soon as he realized what Rufus had said, and he froze in shock for a handful of heavy seconds. He recovered quickly though, and when he did, he stabbed at Rufus' armor with enough force to send pieces of steel splintering in every direction. Rufus let out a cry of pain but offered no other response, knowing it would only encourage his nephew further. Dmitri pointed his spear at Rufus' throat, and a flame sparked in his irises that threatened to consume him and every foe who dared to keep him between his vengeance. "What did you just say?" Dmitri questioned, his voice low and dangerous, a threat and a promise all the same. Rufus, however, said nothing, knowing there was nothing he could possibly tell his nephew that could make this situation any better. Dmitri didn't bother to wait for him to respond though. Instead, he just snarled and shook his head as knights from Frildarius rushed in to arrest him. Rufus had given up on fighting at this point, his axe lost at some point in the shuffle when he wasn't paying attention. He had lost, and he knew it. This would be the day he died. This was where it all ended. Dmitri should have felt like celebrating. Ferdiyad had been reclaimed. His initial goal of helping as many civilians as possible to escape the conflict had been accomplished. Nobody had been hurt along the way aside from the soldiers that dared to side with Rufus to begin with. His side of the battle had sustained minimal casualties, and he and the rest of the Blue Lions were safe and alive. They had all come out of the battle in one piece. Dmitri should have been happy. Instead, he just felt hollow. Looking back, he wasn't surprised at all to hear Rufus confess so openly to playing a part in the tragedy of Duskur. Dmitri had been too kind to Rufus in the past to even consider that he could be involved with the incident, but now, all of that was in the past. The truth had made itself dreadfully apparent, and the fact of the matter was that Dmitri should have asked questions about his uncle a lot sooner. Rufus had a motive from the start to bring such suffering upon others. He wanted the throne at any and all costs, and if that meant seeing to the death of his own brother, that was a price he was willing to pay. Dmitri had tried his best to keep himself calm long enough to question Rufus about everything that had happened, but he hadn't been able to finish the interrogation before he forced himself to leave. Just looking at Rufus for a long time made an anger unlike any other boil up in his stomach and threatened to burst. Rufus had been responsible for the tragedy of Duskur. He was the reason Dmitri's family and friends had died so suddenly. He had wanted the throne badly enough to pay for it in blood, and if all had gone according to plan, Dmitri would have died that day too. He had been counting on it, but the blessings of the goddess had ensured that wasn't the case. It had been luck, but it had destroyed Rufus' life once and for all. Dmitri was going to have to destroy Rufus' life again too. The decision had been made quickly. Rufus needed to be executed for his crimes. Between his involvement in the tragedy of Duskur and everything he had done to try and spark a civil war, he couldn't be allowed to live. As soon as the knights had drawn as much information out of him as they could get, his life would end. That was the price he paid for being the one behind the assassination of the previous king. To say that Dmitri's life had changed drastically in the last few hours would have been a massive understatement. He had previously felt strongly that he needed to try and extend an olive branch to his uncle for the sake of connecting to the only family he still had left. All of that was gone now, and even just the mere thought of Rufus sent Dmitri into a brief spiral of rage. It made so much sense looking back, but that didn't make it any easier to face the truth. Rufus had always been jealous of Lambert. His younger brother had been born with a crest, and he had been cast aside as a result. If left unchecked, that jealousy was bound to boil over eventually, and it resulted in the death of Lambert and the rest of his close allies when they had traveled to Duskur. Rufus had been the one responsible for the deaths of so many people. His greed had run deeply enough that he was willing to murder people for it, and he didn't seem to regret it in the slightest. Beyond that, the assassination in Duskur had spiraled out of control and resulted in a genocide. Rufus hadn't done a thing to stop his people from marching into a country of innocents and slaughtering them for a crime he knew they hadn't committed. He had been too much of a coward to intervene before the people of Duskur could be destroyed. Rufus couldn't even own up to his mistakes after all the people he had killed. Instead, he just sat passively in his cell, waiting to be executed because he knew that was the only salvation left for him. Dmitri couldn't stop thinking about how many people had died the day his father was killed. His mind had been filled with images of the dead ever since Rufus was arrested, and he couldn't seem to escape it no matter how hard he tried. Any sense of calmness or stability that Dmitri had come to know over the years was destroyed the instant he found out that his uncle had been responsible for the mass murder. Rufus had to know how much damage he had done, and he didn't seem to care at all. To call him a monster didn't even come close to expressing the depth of Dmitri's rage. Deep down, he knew he should have been down there helping to question Rufus. Dmitri was fully aware of his duties as a prince and what that meant, especially in a situation like this. However, he couldn't bring himself to return to the dungeon once he had left. The rage inside of him simply burned too deeply, and he couldn't let it go for long enough to look at Rufus again. He could see his uncle before his execution. That had to count for something. It was almost ironic just how quickly Dmitri's thoughts on his uncle had changed. Just a few short hours ago, he had been thinking that he wanted to make amends with his uncle. That morning, he had sent a letter to Rufus asking for him to stop all of this so they could talk it out rather than fighting. Rufus had spat on his desires for peace countless times over the years, and that was before the truth of his part in the mass murder at Dusker came to light. It didn't matter how many times Dmitri tried to be kind to him. Rufus had decided that he would much rather see his nephew dead and suffering, and so, that was what he tried to accomplish. Now, even the mere idea of Dmitri making peace with Rufus was laughable. The truth was out, and Dmitri couldn't go back to being ignorant ever again. They were well beyond that point. He couldn't believe he had ever tried in the first place to connect with his uncle. After all, he had known the truth from the start about the fact that his uncle didn't like him. Why hadn't that been enough to tell Dmitri the relationship wasn't worth it? Dmitri was no fool. Of course he had known that his uncle was trying to kill him. How could he not know? He had been the victim of countless assassination attempts over the years, and many of them only got so far because they were operating under the support of the Grand Duke. Dmitri had never been safe as long as Rufus was around. That was the undisputed truth of the matter, and he despised it. He had wanted peace, but instead, all he was seeing was the ugly truth in all its bloody glory. Rodrigue and Gilbert were handling the questioning of Rufus at the moment. They had insisted on letting Dmitri take a break after everything that had happened. In their eyes, Dmitri had gone through enough, and uncovering the truth behind the assassination of Lambert had been the straw to break the camel's back. Rodrigue and Gilbert both had personal stakes in questioning Rufus, and so, they jumped at the chance to learn more about what had happened. The truth was an ugly, brutal thing, but it was something that needed to be dragged into the light after all this time. They all knew that, but knowing that and bringing it to life were two entirely different things. Ash and Annette were set to arrive in the capital the following day. Now that the conflict was over, the two of them were safe to return. Gus was changing, and Dmitri wanted all of the Blue Lions there to see it. He assumed they would want to be there to see all the ways in which Ferdinand shifted with the death of the Grand Duke. It wouldn't be a simple change, but they would have to figure it out eventually. Gus as a nation was resistant to change. Dmitri had thought about it countless times throughout the day. However, he couldn't bring himself to worry about that too much, at least not for the moment. The people didn't like Rufus much, and he could hardly blame them. Every once in a while, change was necessary, and he was more than happy to bring it about for the sake of the future. Rufus' era on the throne had finally ended, and it should have never happened in the first place, much less under such disgusting conditions. No, that wasn't entirely true. The lingering traces of Rufus' rule could still be felt all across Gus, and his attempt at starting a civil war was causing even more damage. It wouldn't be allowed to end until he had been put to the sword, and Dmitri knew what he had to do. It wouldn't be easy nor would it be what he had wanted when the day began, but he knew what was necessary. For the sake of all the people who had died at Rufus' command, Dmitri would act. And if that meant killing the only family he had left, so be it. After all, Rufus was no longer family to him, and he never would be again. Chapter 20, Fangs of the Executioner. Felix should have been angrier than he was. He knew how everyone expected him to feel. They anticipated seeing him overflowing with rage at the thought of everything Rufus had been responsible for. They were waiting for Felix to snap because of the harm Rufus had left behind. The Grand Duke had been responsible for Glenn's death, and everyone knew it now. The truth had been laid bare, and Felix couldn't escape it now. He hadn't ever been able to get away from it in the first place, but now, there was an extra dimension of brutality to everything he was faced with. It was cruel just how quickly the truth had come out and stabbed him in the back. He wished he could have said he was surprised, but unfortunately, he wasn't even close. Felix had done what he thought he was obligated to. He went to speak with Rufus for a short while to hear the details behind everything that had happened. He listened to the Grand Duke confess to his crimes with a cowardly shake to his voice. All it had taken was a bit of pressure for everything to come rushing to the surface, and Felix heard the truth of what had happened that day. It was sickening just how easy the truth came out. Felix had wanted nothing more than to put the tragedy of Dusker behind him when it first took place, and he chose to not investigate it more than necessary, but now. Well, his attempts to leave the past where it belonged had failed, and he had Rufus to blame for it. As it turned out, Glenn's death was just a coincidence that came with Rufus wanting his younger brother dead. Even if it led to the murder of the other people in Lambert's traveling party, that was a price Rufus was willing to pay. Glenn was just collateral damage. Rufus had tried to destroy the nobles in the kingdom that would push back against him, and in doing so, he had killed everyone in his path save for Dmitri. Felix knew he should have felt more than he did. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to think about tearing Rufus apart for everything he had done. Felix was desperate to let his rage consume him even if only for a while. It felt like a necessity. However, Felix couldn't quite push himself in that direction. Instead, his chest remained hollow, and nothing rushed in to fill the gap left behind by the damage of the past. He just felt empty. That wasn't to say that Felix didn't care about what he had learned. Of course he cared. In fact, he was glad to finally be able to understand the truth behind everything that had taken place up to this point. He hadn't realized it was a weight on his shoulders until it was gone, and now, he was relieved for the breath of fresh air. Glenn's death had hit him hard, and Felix still felt the aftermath of the tragedy so many years later. He cared a lot more than others would ever be able to understand, but he couldn't quite bring himself to express that. He didn't even know where to start. How could he tell the world that he was struggling with everything that had happened? It barely felt real to begin with. The truth had come out in the way he had least expected, and it made him feel sick to his stomach. Felix stood on one of the many balconies in the castle as he overlooked the surrounding city. He pressed his hands against the banister and tilted his face down, prompting his loose hair to create a curtain that blocked his features from the rest of the world. He could feel a headache sparking at the back of his skull as the sun set in front of him. He was exhausted, and the weight of the day's events was finally starting to pull him apart. He wasn't necessarily surprised, but that didn't mean he liked having to face it. How could anyone like hearing the truth behind the sudden and brutal murder of their brother from years prior? It was something no one should have ever had to deal with, and yet, there Felix was, hating Rufus with every ounce of his exhausted body. Felix. Somehow, he wasn't surprised to hear Ingrid's voice from behind him. Felix didn't move to look at her though. Instead, he just forced his eyes shut, wondering if maybe she would go away if he ignored her enough. Felix needed time to himself, and that meant not hearing Ingrid go on about her sense of justice and how that influenced the world around her. On his better days, Felix could deal with her obsession with knighthood and chivalry. Today, however, Felix just thought of it as a headache. He didn't need the reminder that came with Glenn's death today of all days. Hadn't he been given enough to deal with already? "What do you want, Ingrid?" Felix muttered, unable to keep the bitter twinge out of his voice. He wished he had something of value to tell her, but nothing came to mind. He was exhausted, and he needed a break from all of this. He wouldn't be given that break though, and he was fully aware of it. If the universe wanted to give him a chance to breathe, then it would have done so already. "I'm just here to talk," Ingrid said, keeping her voice surprisingly even in response to Felix's snappiness. She approached him carefully, giving him the time and space he needed to walk away if that was what he wanted. When he didn't run out of some quiet sense of stubbornness he didn't even entirely understand, Ingrid settled down beside him. She leaned over and pressed her elbows against the banister as well, and she stared at the city below with nostalgic shadows in her irises. "A lot happened today, huh?" "That's one way of putting it," Felix commented even though it felt like the understatement of the century. He found himself struggling to find the words he needed even with Ingrid standing there and waiting for him to talk. What could he even say? A member of the royal family had been responsible for his brother's death. The people of Dusker had died because of a feud among members of the bloodline that led Faergus. So many people had walked to their deaths that day without knowing it because of Rufus' greed. He refused to calm his jealousy, and it led to a massacre he refused to own up to until he was on the verge of his death. Ingrid waited for an uncomfortably long time for Felix to respond, but when he said nothing, she allowed herself to sigh. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened that day," she confessed. "Glenn. He died because of the Grand Duke. None of us knew it at the time, but that was what happened. The Grand Duke just went on with his life like nothing had happened even after he was responsible for the deaths of so many people. He knew most of them, but that didn't matter. If it would serve his own purposes, nothing mattered," Felix told her. "That's what people like him are like. If they think something is a threat to them, then they'll get rid of it at any cost. It doesn't matter how many people have to die in order for them to accomplish their goals. That's just how the world works." "I know that," Ingrid said, though Felix had to wonder if she really did know it. She sighed after fumbling to find the proper words for an eternity and a half. "It hurts a lot more than I thought it would. I always thought there was more to this than met the eye, but this. I never expected it would be anything like this." "Did you hear that other Western nobles were probably involved too?" Felix asked even though it was a pointless question. Of course she knew about it. Ingrid had gone down to question Rufus as well, and as far as Felix had heard, she had walked away after less than half an hour. The truth of what Rufus had done hit her too close to home, and she didn't know how to handle it. She knew the truth, but knowing something and being willing to face it were two entirely different matters. "I did," Ingrid nodded. "I never would have thought so many people would be involved with this, but I guess it makes sense. It wouldn't be possible to pull off a massive attack like that without a bit of outside help. The Empire was partially responsible too," Felix went on. "The Regent came here around the time of the attack, and if I had to guess, I would say that was the spark that set everything into motion. He was recently driven out of the Empire's capital too. That was why the Black Eagles left with the Knights of Syros. They had reason to believe he was affiliated with the enemy, and it looks like they were right. The tragedy was a conspiracy that involved at least half of the nobles in the kingdom as well as a high-ranking family from the Empire. It makes a lot of sense now, but it still hurts to think about," Ingrid confessed. "I doubt any of them thought twice about what they were doing. It didn't matter how many people died as long as they would be able to get what they wanted out of this." Felix snorted at that. "I doubt the thought even crossed their minds to give a damn about their victims. They knew what they wanted, and if they were going to accomplish it, then they had to stay focused. That meant not thinking at all about the people they could have hurt along the way. Nothing mattered to them aside from getting their work done and putting the plan into motion. If that meant killing every person at the site of the attack, then so be it. That was all they cared about." Ingrid nodded dully, and she pressed her hands to her chest uncertainly. She was trembling, but neither one of them did anything to comment on it. "I wonder what Glenn would think right now," she murmured. "How would he react to hearing about this? Would he be happy that we finally uncovered the truth behind everyone who died that day?" Felix didn't have a response for that. He had been racking his brain for an answer to the same question all day, but he had never come close. Instead, his mind always seemed to find an excuse to mask the truth from him just before he could reach it. He had no idea how Glenn would have reacted to learning that the truth behind his death had been brought to light. In all honesty, Felix had to wonder if it even mattered. Would Glenn care at all? Did thinking about it change anything? No, of course it didn't change things. Glenn was dead and had been for a long time. Felix had understood that years ago and left the truth buried in the ground along with his brother. There was no point in trying to live up to the legacy of a dead man. His father hated having to hear it, but that was the truth of the matter. Felix knew there was more to life than simply trying to appease the dead, and he wished Dmitri understood it too. At the end of the day, musing on what Glenn thought of everything that had happened that day didn't help nor did it change anything. But that didn't stop Felix from thinking about it. He had numbed out his emotions toward his brother after the tragedy, but everything was thawing out with surprising speed and brutality in light of the truth being dragged out for all to see. Felix had thought he was overthinking about this in general, but instead, he found himself swallowed by his paranoia over his brother all over again. He didn't want to think about this, but at the same time, he couldn't escape it. No matter how much he wanted to bury the truth and never think about it again, Felix missed his brother. He wanted Glenn back, but there was nothing he could do to fix his circumstances. His brother was gone, and there was nothing Felix could do to change that. Discovering who had been responsible for the tragedy hadn't fixed the heart of the problem, and Felix knew it. It doesn't matter, Felix finally forced himself to say. He ignored the rock that had formed in his chest while he was dwelling on the subject, instead pulling his spine into an upright position and starting back toward the entrance to the castle. He's dead, and there's nothing we can do to fix that. All that's left is to wait for the Grand Duke to be executed. He's more than earned it if you ask me. Ingrid stared at Felix as he left, and once she was alone, she let out a heavy sigh. She wasn't surprised to see him leave. She had been hoping he would stay with her given their connection to Glenn that informed so much of their relationship in present day, but she couldn't force him to do anything he wasn't comfortable with. If Felix needed space, then she would be happy to give it to him. She ignored the way her heart twisted into a knot in her chest at the sight of his departure, instead just shaking her head before turning her attention back to the city below. The following evening, the streets would be filled with people eager to see Rufus' execution. As far as Ingrid could tell, most of them had anticipated a conflict between Dimitri and Rufus to break out eventually, and this was just a natural consequence of every expectation they had ever held. Coming to see the execution made perfect sense for the people of Faerghus. Some of them were even bold enough to look forward to it, not that they would dare to say so out loud. After all, confessing to wanting a change in their country would be tantamount to treason in a nation as traditional as Faerghus. Ingrid didn't know if she was ready for the execution, but she would figure it out eventually. She would have to prepare herself whether she wanted to or not. It wouldn't be easy, but what other choice did she have? She owed it to Dimitri, Glenn, and everyone else who had suffered that day in Dusker to go and see Rufus' final moments. She may not have known what Glenn would have wanted for her, but she was sure that she needed to be there to witness Rufus' death. Maybe it was for her own closure. Did it even matter? It was hard to say how long Ingrid stayed there on the balcony after Felix left. She rose to her full height and started back into the castle once the sun had slipped over the horizon entirely though. The day had been long, and she needed to rest before the execution the following evening. She doubted she would be able to sleep all that well given what she had come to understand in the last few hours, but she owed it to herself to try. It wasn't as if the following day would be any easier. Oh, how bitterly quickly things could change. By the time Ash and Annette arrived in the capital, it was bustling with activity. Soon after Rufus' capture, the final pair of blue lions were summoned back for the sake of seeing the execution. They got to Fhirdiad the day after Rufus was taken into captivity, and that left them with a few hours to catch up on everything they had missed before Rufus lost his head later that night. Annette couldn't exactly say she was looking forward to it, but the situation could have been worse, she supposed. She was glad he had been stopped before he could hurt anyone else. That had to count for something, right? Annette walked into the castle slowly after meandering through the streets of Fhirdiad. She had told Ash to go on ahead and not wait up for her in part because she didn't want to make him waste all his time on wandering around. Annette didn't want to go and see her father yet, so she did everything she could to make her journey to the castle as slow as possible. It didn't work out exactly the way she would have liked, but it was at least something, and she was willing to take it. She swallowed anxiously and forced herself to focus on the matter at hand even as her mind told her to run and hide. She needed to be there for the rest of her friends. She couldn't back down now. Annette sighed as she crossed through the threshold into the palace, ignoring the sudden stench of blood that assaulted her nostrils. She wasn't exactly surprised how strongly the smell permeated the air given that a battle had taken place there just the day before, but it still made her feel even worse. She hadn't even thought that was possible, and yet, the universe loved to find new ways to surprise her. She was confident things would only go downhill from there, especially since her father was also in the castle somewhere. It was just a matter of time before she saw him again. Sure enough, Annette saw Gilbert just 2 minutes after she walked into the castle, and she froze on the spot. He was speaking with Rodrigue in hushed tones, so she couldn't make out quite what they were saying. However, she was smart enough to assume they were discussing Rufus in some way or another. What else would they be talking about? It wasn't every day the people of Faergus were dragged into an attempted coup that ended with the Grand Duke being put to the sword. That left a lot for anyone to deal with, and the closest retainers to the crown were the ones most impacted of all. Annette stared at Gilbert for an uncomfortably long time, her heart racing in her chest. She tried her best to move on, to just walk away and leave him be, but she couldn't force herself to depart. Her feet felt as if they had been rooted to the spot, and all she could do was stare. There Gilbert was again. She wasn't surprised to see him, but it still hurt. He was there looking after his country, but he couldn't be asked to do the same for his daughter. He had deliberately ignored Annette so many times back at the monastery, and while she wasn't expecting him to suddenly talk to her now, it stung regardless. She just wanted her father back, but it seemed as if he didn't want her at all. Just when Annette thought things couldn't get any worse, Gilbert looked up from his conversation with Rodrigue. The two locked eyes, and the young girl felt tears rise before she had the chance to stop them. She couldn't quite read her father's expression, but she knew there was a lot on his mind she could never even hope to understand. Before he had the chance to explain any of it, Annette finally got her legs to move, and she darted away as quickly as she could. She just wanted to escape. She hadn't fought in the last battle in part because of her uncle, but she was trying to avoid the pain seeing her father brought to her just as much. It was just too much to bear. It was difficult to say where Annette had wound up in the castle by the time she finally stopped running, but she didn't particularly care to find out either. Instead, she just pressed her back against the nearby wall and shoved her face into her hands. She was shaking, but she knew there was no way for her to stop that. She hadn't wanted any of this, and the pain that came with it was too overwhelming for her to bear. She just wanted her father back, but apparently, that was too much to ask for. Before Annette could hold herself back, she had started to cry. She kept herself as quiet as possible, but that was much easier said than done. It was just too much for her to handle. She needed a break from all of this, and she had only just arrived. How ridiculous was that? All of a sudden, she was looking forward to the execution. It wasn't something she wanted to see, but at least it would be a distraction from all of this. She was willing to take what she could get at this point. Annette had heard what Rufus had been responsible for, and she hated him more than she could ever hope to describe. He had sparked the tragedy that prompted her father to leave her behind. Rufus was the reason Gilbert had left. No. That wasn't entirely true. Gilbert had left of his own free will. He had chosen to leave his family behind. Annette could try and blame Rufus all she wanted, but the fact of the matter was that her father had chosen to walk away. She still hated the Grand Duke, of course, but she couldn't push all of the guilt for Gilbert's departure onto him. There was much more to it than that, and it only made the hole in her chest deeper. She wanted the ground to swallow her whole just so she would have the chance to escape it. The execution was in a few hours. Maybe that would bring her some degree of peace. Somehow though, Annette already knew that wouldn't be the case. The rest of the day was a dizzying haze nobody bothered to remember. The knights from both Faergus and the Church of Ceros pressed as many answers as they could out of Rufus, but aside from that, nothing remarkable happened. The entire city of Fhirdiadno, the entire country of Faergus was holding its breath in anticipation for the execution. So when the sun began to set, the people of the capital finally left their homes for the first time since the battle began to see the death of their temporary monarch. The crowd clamored and chattered in a way that made Dimitri's head feel as if it was filled with static. He stood in front of the castle beside Rufus, a blade in his hand. His gaze was empty, and he noticed nothing of the world around him. He knew what was expected of him, but that didn't mean he had to like it. In fact, he despised it with everything he had. Behind Dimitri, Gilbert and Dida stood together. Neither one of them had openly voiced their feelings on the matter of Rufus' actions to Dimitri, no doubt trying to keep themselves from burdening the prince, but it was easy enough to assume what they were thinking. Gilbert was enraged with the man who had killed the previous king and so many others in the pursuit of power. Dida mourned for those who had been lost because of Rufus' greedy cowardice. The entirety of Dusker would grieve today for everything that could have been but never would be because of Rufus. Grief was all they had left. The rest of the Blue Lions were gathered together in the crowd near the front. Rodrigue and Matthias stood with the current class, looking up at Rufus with frowns etched onto their faces. Even though they had been closer with Lambert out of the two royal siblings, they had known Rufus for as long as they had been alive. The thought of their old friend so thoroughly stabbing them in the back still stung. The fact that Matthias was there at all was proof of that. He had rushed to the capital as soon as he heard the news, and he had only barely arrived in time to see the execution. It was something he wouldn't have missed for the world though. No one who had ever loved Rufus would have missed this. Dmitri looked down to his uncle with a frown on his face. All of a sudden, the countless eyes on him overwhelmed his senses. He realized all too late just how many people were watching him and waiting for him to swing his blade. They all sought Rufus' death, and whatever came after that was just a matter of consequence. The Holy Kingdom of Faerghus was going to change for the first time in ages, and nobody knew what to do about it. For the first time in Dimitri's many years of life, people wanted to change, and he had no idea what to do about it. So he chose not to address the crowd at all. He knew there was nothing he could have said in the first place. Any and all words that came to mind felt forced and stilted in a way that made them disingenuous, too much so for him to speak them. Instead, Dmitri just hardened his gaze into a glare down at Rufus. Final words. None for you, Rufus scoffed. Even now, he did not care about what he had been forced to do. All that mattered was that he had gotten caught. He would pay the consequences of that, but he would not care for the lives he sacrificed on the altar of his ambition. But tell me something, boy. Does it trouble you slay your own kin? Dmitri opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he was just hit by a wave of shocked sadness. He hadn't wanted to do this. He had wanted so desperately to give his uncle a chance, and he had done so countless times over the years. Each time though, his kindness had been spat on, and Dmitri could only extend so many second chances. Rufus had chosen where his loyalties rested the day he ordered the murder of his brother and everyone in his traveling party. He had decided where his future would go when he did not stand up for the people of Dusker when they were falsely accused of regicide. He had made up his mind when he continued to try to kill his nephew. Did it trouble Rufus to slay his own kin? Did Dmitri even want to know? Did it trouble you? Dmitri asked before he had the chance to stop himself. He already doubted he would get an answer he would be satisfied with. What answer could make him happy after everything that had happened? There was nothing that would make this simpler. He knew that, and there was nothing he could do about it. As was to be expected, Rufus said nothing for a long time. Instead, he simply shook his head. You would not understand it regardless of what I said, he muttered. I know you are not capable of sympathy, craven monster that you are. I know the truth of what you are. A beast in human skin. Dmitri raised his blade. He wasn't shocked at all by the response he had received, but it made his heart race with rage and grief all the same. Perhaps. But either way, I do what I must, he told his uncle. Dmitri's sword gleamed gladly under the rays of the setting sun. It knew what was coming just as much as he did, and it was ready. Rufus raised his head to look at the setting sun, not averting his gaze even as the overwhelming light began to strain his eyes. Well. To perish by your hand. It is a fate that I much deserve. Dmitri's blade came down a moment later, and the world jolted in ways the prince was not expecting. Rufus' body collapsed lifelessly at his feet, and the crowd before him roared. Dmitri barely noticed the noise at all though. It was little more than a distant cacophony in the back of his mind, and he just stared ahead. He had done it. He had killed the one responsible for the death of his father. He had murdered the leader of the group that had sought the destruction of the kingdom so many years ago. And yet, he did not know what he felt. The world fell away, and Dmitri knew nothing aside from the blade in his hand and the blood on the palace steps before him. It was as if no person existed anymore, and even if they had, they wouldn't have mattered much to him at all. To say he was overwhelmed was a grave understatement. No explanation of his emotions could have even come close to expressing what he was going through, and so, he chose to not elaborate at all. Instead, Dmitri just tilted his head toward the sky. He wondered if perhaps the people who had died that day in Dusker were happy with what he had done. Were they glad their killer had been laid to rest at long last? Were they satisfied knowing the past had finally been abandoned where it belonged? Would they be able to feel the joy that came with Rufus' execution? The sunlight danced across Dimitri's face, and his sword felt like a lead weight in his hand. He refused to drop it though, instead simply closing his eyes as the cheering of the crowd before him reached a fever pitch. In time, they would disperse, and Faergus would begin to change. Before the end of the week, he would be crowned king for better or worse. Dmitri wished he knew how to feel. Instead, his chest remained hollow, and all he could do was stare at the back of his eyelids and wait for an answer that would never come. Check the description for the links to the author.